The Artra building's grand ballroom glittered with the subtle extravagance that only truly exceptional wealth could manifest, not in gaudy displays, but in the quiet confidence of perfection. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across the gathering of Silicon Valley's elite, casting a warm glow over the meticulously arranged tables with their hand-calligraphed place cards and centerpieces of orchids flown in from Singapore that morning. The anniversary celebration, doubling as the annual investors' meeting for Reynolds Technologies, represented exactly what Alexander Reynolds had built his reputation upon: seamless integration of personal brand and corporate excellence, all wrapped in a narrative of visionary brilliance. Valerie Reynolds adjusted the sleek lines of her Valentino gown, the one Alexander's stylist had selected after rejecting her initial choice as too academic, darling, as the private elevator ascended to the penthouse ballroom. She had precisely catalogued the stylist's subtle grimace, filed it alongside thousands of similar micro-expressions she'd observed over 15 years of marriage to one of tech's most celebrated entrepreneurs. The diamond bracelet at her wrist, an anniversary gift delivered that morning with a card signed by Alexander's assistant, caught the elevator's subdued lighting, fracturing it into prismatic patterns that momentarily distracted from the weight of what she carried in her clutch. Not the usual lipstick and credit cards, but a small, encrypted drive containing the culmination of 6 months of investigation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the encryption algorithm protecting these files was her own design, one of many contributions she'd made to Reynolds Technologies that had been quietly absorbed into the company's portfolio without her name attached. Ready to dazzle them, beautiful? Alexander's voice interrupted her thoughts as the elevator doors opened directly into the private reception area. At 45, he remained almost offensively handsome, tall and trim in his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, silver threading artfully through his dark hair in exactly the places that suggested distinguished experience rather than age. His smile, the same one that had graced the covers of Forbes, Wired, and Time, activated with practiced precision. Always, Valerie replied with a practiced smile she perfected over 15 years, genuine enough to pass close inspection but containing a reservation known only to her. Her response was calibrated perfectly, warmth without servility, elegance without effort. The role of trophy wife required nuanced performance. Too much enthusiasm appeared desperate, too little seemed ungrateful. Alexander had never suspected that her ability to modulate this performance came from the same analytical mind that had earned her MIT Masters in Computer Engineering and PhD in Artificial Intelligence before she'd met him. The Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund representatives arrived early. They're eager to see the prototype demonstration. Alexander guided her with a proprietary hand at the small of her back. I've seated them at the central table. Helen arranged the placement cards to ensure they have the optimal view of both the stage and you, my perfect visual asset. He delivered this last part with what he clearly believed was affectionate humor, unaware that Valerie had spent years documenting such comments in a password-protected file titled Evidence of Systematic Diminishment. I'm sure Helen thought of everything, Valerie acknowledged, referring to Alexander's executive assistant who had essentially managed their marriage for the past decade, scheduling their limited time together, selecting appropriate gifts for Valerie on Alexander's behalf, and maintaining the narrative of their perfect partnership for public consumption. The ballroom opened before them, already filled with 78 carefully selected guests representing over $4.2 billion in current or potential investment in Reynolds Technologies. Valerie had memorized the dossier on each attendee, their portfolios, personal histories, risk tolerances, and psychological triggers. Information Alexander would be surprised to know she had accessed, much less analyzed with the same algorithmic precision she had once applied to neural network optimization in her former life as Dr. Valerie Chen, rising star in artificial intelligence research, before becoming Mrs. Reynolds, decorative appendage. There she is, the woman who keeps our visionary grounded. Cameron Williams, Reynolds Technologies CFO, approached with practiced enthusiasm. Valerie, you look absolutely stunning. That color is remarkable with your complexion. Thank you, Cameron. It's called cerulean persuasion according to the designer, she replied, noting how his eyes never quite reached hers, instead cataloging the estimated value of her appearance, dress, jewelry, professional styling, as assets on a balance sheet. Cameron had never once, in the 8 years since Alexander had hired him from Goldman Sachs, asked Valerie about her thoughts on anything more substantial than interior design trends or charity gala themes. "Cameron's been working miracles with our Q3 projections," Alexander interjected, seamlessly redirecting the conversation to business. "The AI implementation timeline acceleration has the investment committee practically throwing money at us." "Impressive," Valerie responded, knowing that the AI implementation timeline acceleration was a carefully constructed fiction. The quantum processing advantage that Alexander had been promising investors was fundamentally unworkable with their current architecture, a fact she had discovered during her clandestine review of the company's technical documentation. The algorithm simply couldn't perform as claimed on the hardware Reynolds Technologies had developed, creating a gap between promise and reality that was being bridged with increasingly creative financial engineering and demonstration sleight of hand. "Well, it helps when the technology is revolutionary," Cameron replied with the practiced humility of someone taking credit while appearing to deflect it. "The prototype demonstration tonight should leave no doubt in anyone's mind that Reynolds Technologies is years ahead of any competitor." Valerie knew precisely what the prototype demonstration entailed, a carefully orchestrated simulation running on hidden hardware, presented as if it were the actual Reynolds quantum processing architecture. She had found the evidence in partition server space that Alexander didn't know she could access, complete with contingency plans for technical difficulties that would necessitate falling back to pre-recorded results if the live simulation failed. It was elegant deception, she had to admit, something only someone with her specialized knowledge would be able to detect. "I should make the rounds," Alexander said, his attention already shifting to the Japanese investment consortium representatives who had just arrived. "Darling, why don't you charm the Adler Venture partners? They brought their wives this time. Give them someone to talk to while I discuss the Series E details with Howard." The dismissal was so practiced that most would miss its fundamental condescension, the implicit assumption that Valerie's function was purely social and decorative, incapable of contributing to discussions of substance. Alexander had never bothered to learn that before retiring to become his wife. She had developed 3 fundamental patents that formed the foundation of his first successful product, innovations she had generously allowed to be absorbed into Reynolds Technologies during their early marriage, when she still believed in their partnership as equals. "Of course," she agreed, moving with practiced grace toward the cluster of venture capitalists and their spouses. What Alexander would never understand was how these seemingly trivial social interactions had allowed Valerie to build her own network, gathering intelligence, forming alliances, and quietly establishing her credibility with key players in the industry. The wives and partners he so casually dismissed had their own spheres of influence, their own insights, and often, their own capital. Valerie, the woman behind the genius, Howard Adler greeted her with European-style kisses on both cheeks. His wife, Rebecca, a Stanford-trained chemical engineer who had left her own promising career to support Howard's ambitions, stood beside him with the same carefully calibrated smile that Valerie had perfected. "Howard, Rebecca," Valerie acknowledged them both, giving Rebecca's hand a subtle extra squeeze of recognition, woman to woman, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience of erasure. "How was Barcelona? I saw your yacht was docked there last month." Howard's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't posted about the Barcelona trip on any public channels, wanting to keep the tax implications of their European sojourn private. What he didn't know was that Valerie maintained a sophisticated monitoring system tracking the movements of key Reynolds investors through everything from Port Authority records to private air traffic logs. "You have remarkable sources," he commented, a new note of respect in his voice. "I take an interest in our investors' lives," she replied smoothly. "It helps me ensure Alexander creates the right opportunities for connection." This was the careful line Valerie walked, demonstrating enough intelligence and savvy to be respected, but never so much that it threatened Alexander's narrative of being the singular genius behind Reynolds Technologies. She had spent years calibrating this performance, establishing herself as gracious and perceptive while never revealing the full extent of her capabilities or knowledge. "Your husband is making bold promises about tonight's demonstration," Rebecca commented, her scientific training evident in the precision of her skepticism. "Quantum coherence at that scale would represent a fundamental breakthrough in the field." "Alexander has always been motivated by achieving the impossible," Valerie responded, offering neither confirmation nor denial of the technology's capabilities. It was a diplomatic non-answer that she had refined over years of navigating the increasingly wide gap between Reynolds Technologies' public claims and private realities. The evening proceeded according to the meticulously planned schedule that Helen had distributed to key staff members, cocktails and networking transitioning seamlessly into dinner, the soft lighting dimming further to direct attention to the small stage where Alexander would make his anniversary speech and company presentation. Valerie moved through the room with practiced ease, her interactions calibrated to leave each person feeling uniquely appreciated while revealing nothing of substance about herself or the company. At precisely 8:45 p.m., the crystal chime of a fork against glass cut through the ambient conversation. Cameron Williams stood at the center of the room, his CFO's instinctive command of attention bringing the gathered investors to polite silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished partners and friends of Reynolds Technologies, may I direct your attention to the stage for a special presentation from our founder and CEO, a man whose vision is redefining the boundaries between possible and impossible, Alexander Reynolds." The applause was appropriately enthusiastic as Alexander took the stage, his presence commanding without obvious effort, the result of thousands of hours of presentation coaching and a natural charisma enhanced by the confidence that comes from 15 years of having one's mythology carefully maintained. "Thank you, Cameron. And thank you all for joining us on this doubly special evening," Alexander began, his voice modulated to project both authority and approachability. "Today we not only celebrate Reynolds Technologies' continued evolution as the leader in quantum-enhanced artificial intelligence, but also a personal milestone, 15 years of marriage to my greatest inspiration and support." He extended his hand toward Valerie, prompting the spotlight to find her among the tables. She rose with graceful acknowledgement, accepting the cue for her role in this carefully choreographed narrative. "Valerie, my love, I wouldn't be standing here today without your unwavering support. While I was building algorithms and chasing quantum coherence, you were creating the perfect haven that allows me to think, to innovate, to dream." His smile held the practiced sincerity that had convinced investors to entrust him with billions. 15 years of being my rock, my perfect partner, my beautiful inspiration. Everyone here knows you as my trophy wife, and what a trophy you are." The audience laughed appreciatively at what they perceived as affectionate teasing between spouses. Valerie maintained her warm smile, even as she catalogued this public diminishment alongside hundreds of similar statements in her mental evidence file. What none of them knew, what Alexander himself had never bothered to discover, was that during these 15 years of creating his perfect haven, she had also been quietly building something else entirely. Now, as we celebrate this personal milestone, I'm thrilled to share a professional breakthrough that will transform Reynolds Technologies from industry leader to technological revolutionary, Alexander continued, transitioning smoothly to the business presentation. "Tonight, we demonstrate the first truly functional quantum-enhanced artificial intelligence system capable of maintaining coherence across distributed processing nodes." Valerie watched the investors lean forward in their seats, captivated by the promise of technology so advanced it would secure their place at the forefront of the AI revolution. What they didn't realize, what only she had discovered through months of careful investigation, was that the system Alexander was about to demonstrate simply didn't work as claimed. The quantum coherence he promised remained an aspirational goal rather than a functional reality, the distributed processing capabilities more simulation than actual performance. "Before I reveal what this technology can do, I'd like to acknowledge the brilliant team that has helped bring my vision to life," Alexander continued, gesturing to a row of Reynolds Technologies executives and lead engineers seated at a prominent table. "These remarkable minds have translated theoretical possibilities into functioning reality under my direction." Valerie noted that despite the seeming acknowledgement of the team, Alexander's language carefully maintained his position as the visionary origin of all innovation. The "under my direction" qualifier transformed recognition into a reinforcement of hierarchy, positioning the entire team as merely implementers of his singular genius. It was a subtle linguistic pattern she had documented extensively in her analysis of his public statements. And of course, Alexander added with what appeared to be spontaneous warmth but was actually scheduled in Helen's meticulous run-of-show document, "I must acknowledge my beautiful wife once more. While she may not understand the technical complexities of what we do, having focused her considerable talents on creating the perfect support system for innovation, Her belief in me has been instrumental. Darling, you're proof that behind every successful man is a woman who makes success possible by handling all those domestic details that would otherwise distract from the important work." Another wave of appreciative laughter rippled through the room. Valerie's expression remained warmly attentive, betraying nothing of her internal response to being positioned as a glorified housekeeper rather than the MIT and Stanford-educated artificial intelligence expert whose early patents had formed the foundation of Reynolds Technologies' initial success. What Alexander had never bothered to learn was that Valerie understood the technical complexities far better than he did. Her doctoral research in quantum algorithm optimization had been years ahead of its time, work she had set aside when they married, believing they would build Reynolds Technologies together as intellectual partners. That illusion had dissipated within their first year of marriage as Alexander systematically excluded her from substantive company discussions while simultaneously relying on her technical insights during their private conversations, only to present them as his own breakthroughs in subsequent investor meetings. "Now, let me show you the future," Alexander proclaimed, triggering the dimming of lights and activation of the presentation system. "What you're about to witness is the Reynolds quantum network achieving multi-node coherence while optimizing a complex pharmaceutical development model, something that would take traditional computing systems months to process." The large screens surrounding the ballroom illuminated with impressive visualizations of molecular structures being analyzed and reconfigured at apparently remarkable speeds. Valerie knew exactly what they were seeing, not an actual quantum system performing real-time analysis, but a pre-calculated simulation designed to give the appearance of revolutionary processing capabilities. She had found the presentation files on the company servers, along with contingency versions for different audience reactions. The gathered investors watched in appreciative silence, occasionally murmuring to each other as particularly impressive visualizations appeared. These were sophisticated individuals not easily misled, but the presentation had been crafted to exploit a fundamental knowledge gap. Even technically adept investors lack the specialized expertise to distinguish between actual quantum computing breakthroughs and well-designed simulations mimicking expected results. "What you're seeing represents a 30,000-fold improvement over any competing system," Alexander claimed, the precise figure selected to be impressive yet just plausible enough to avoid triggering immediate skepticism. Reynolds' quantum network has achieved stable coherence across 17 processing nodes, something theoretical physicists claimed would be impossible for at least another decade. Valerie knew the reality. Reynolds Technologies have managed coherence across 3 nodes under highly controlled laboratory conditions for approximately 1.3 seconds before decoherence rendered the system no more effective than conventional computing approaches. The 17-node claim was purely fictional, supported by manipulated test results and simulated performance data rather than actual technological achievement. As Alexander continued his presentation, Valerie's mind moved beyond the immediate deception to the more troubling financial implications. Reynolds Technologies had attracted over $2.7 billion in investment based substantially on the promised quantum computing breakthrough. Without delivering functional technology that even approached these claims, the company was essentially operating as an elaborate Ponzi scheme, using new investment to maintain the illusion of progress while actually falling further behind the technological reality required to deliver on its promises. More disturbing was what she had discovered about Alexander's contingency plans. Her investigation had revealed transfer patterns suggesting he was systematically extracting personal wealth from the company through a network of shell entities and consulting arrangements, positioning himself for personal financial security regardless of whether Reynolds Technologies ultimately succeeded or collapsed. It was sophisticated self-dealing hidden behind complex corporate structures that would be difficult even for experienced forensic accountants to unravel. "We are now accepting a limited number of strategic investment partners for our Series E funding round," Alexander announced, reaching the carefully timed call to action in his presentation. "This represents the final private investment opportunity before our anticipated public offering next year. Given the breakthrough you've witnessed tonight, we expect this round to be substantially oversubscribed." The manufactured scarcity was a classic technique, creating the impression that investors would be fortunate to participate rather than questioning whether the opportunity was legitimate. Valerie had seen this pattern repeated throughout their marriage, watching as Alexander refined his ability to transform promises into capital, all while the gap between those promises and technological reality grew ever wider. To celebrate both our 15th anniversary and this technological milestone, I've asked my wonderful wife to join me on stage, Alexander continued, extending his hand toward Valerie with camera-ready affection. After all, she's not just the perfect partner who makes all this possible, she's also my most treasured trophy from a life of achievement. The audience laughed appreciatively at what they perceived as affectionate humor rather than the fundamental diminishment it actually represented. Valerie rose with practiced grace, moving toward the stage with measured steps that betrayed nothing of the weight of the encrypted drive in her clutch or the decision she had reached after months of careful consideration and preparation. Alexander welcomed her with a camera-ready embrace and professionally calibrated kiss, passionate enough to suggest genuine affection but restrained enough to maintain appropriate decorum. 15 years of marriage had taught Valerie to recognize the subtle differences between his public affection and private indifference, the performance of partnership versus the reality of her systematic erasure from any meaningful role in their shared enterprise. 15 years with this remarkable woman, Alexander told the audience, his arm around Valerie's waist in a gesture that appeared affectionate but actually served to position her slightly behind him, literally and symbolically in his shadow. I often tell people that finding Valerie was a greater achievement than founding Reynolds Technologies. After all, the company merely revolutionized computing. Valerie revolutionized my life, the audience responded with appropriate appreciation for this seemingly heartfelt sentiment. Valerie maintained her warm smile, her expression revealing nothing of her internal calculation regarding timing and approach for what would come next. "Darling, would you like to say a few words?" Alexander offered with apparent generosity, though Valerie recognized it as a calculated inclusion that had been explicitly scheduled in Helen's run-of-show document. 8:57 p.m. AJR invites VR to make brief remarks, 30 to 45 seconds maximum, before returning to technology presentation. "I would, thank you," Valerie replied, accepting the microphone with a composed smile that revealed nothing of the seismic shift about to occur. She turned to face the assembled investors, partners, and executives who had gathered to celebrate both a marriage and a company built on carefully constructed illusions. 15 years ago, I made a choice to step back from my own career in artificial intelligence research to support Alexander's vision for Reynolds Technologies, she began, her voice clear and measured. The audience nodded appreciatively at what they assumed was the beginning of a gracious tribute to her husband's genius and her supportive role in his success. Alexander's hand rested at the small of her back, a gesture that appeared affectionately supportive to observers but which Valerie recognized as a subtle attempt to maintain control of her time at the microphone. The slight pressure of his fingers signaled his expectation that she would keep her comments brief and in line with the company narrative. "What most of you don't know," Valerie continued, feeling Alexander's fingers tense against her back as she deviated from the expected script of wifely gratitude, "is that before I became Mrs. Reynolds, one was Drive." Valerie Chen, with a PhD in artificial intelligence and specialization in quantum algorithm optimization from Stanford, following my master's in computer engineering from MIT. A subtle shift rippled through the audience, confusion mixed with reassessment as they adjusted their perception of the woman they had been conditioned to view as merely decorative. Alexander's hand at her back now pressed more firmly, his silent signal to conclude becoming more urgent. "I've listened with interest to tonight's presentation on the Reynolds Quantum Network and its claimed achievement of 17-node coherence," Valerie continued, her tone pleasant but her words precise as surgical instruments. "It's fascinating work, particularly given that stable quantum coherence beyond 3 nodes remains theoretical rather than practical with current Reynolds architecture limitations." The room fell completely silent. Alexander's hand dropped from her back as he recognized the severity of the departure from script. The gathered investors, sophisticated enough to understand the implications of her statement, shifted from confused to alert, their attention now fully focused on this unexpected development. "Perhaps even more interesting than the technical claims," Valerie continued into the silence, "are the financial structures supporting Reynolds Technologies' operations, particularly the network of shell companies that have received approximately $218 million in consulting fees over the past 30 months, entities that trace back to personal holdings rather than operational business partners." Alexander stepped forward, attempting to reclaim control of the situation with a practiced laugh. My wife has such a delightful sense of humor. All this technical terminology she's picked up from listening to my work calls. Now, if we could return to the actual presentation. I'm not quite finished, Alexander, Valerie responded with calm authority that effectively silenced him, a power dynamic reversal so unexpected that he momentarily froze in confusion. She opened her clutch and removed the encrypted drive, holding it up for the audience to see. This drive contains comprehensive documentation of both the actual state of Reynolds quantum network development and the financial structures I've just referenced. It includes server logs, internal communication, technical specifications, financial transfers, and corporate formation documents that together present a complete picture of the disparity between public claims and private reality. The room erupted in confused murmuring as investors processed the implications of her statement. Alexander recovered from his initial shock, reaching for the microphone with a tightly controlled expression that Valerie recognized as his crisis management mode. Clearly my wife is overtired from the excitement of the evening, he attempted, his voice strained despite his effort to maintain composure. Perhaps we should take a brief intermission before continuing with the actual technology demonstration. That would be convenient, Valerie acknowledged with deceptive pleasantness, particularly since the actual technology demonstration you're presenting is a pre-rendered simulation rather than live quantum processing. The file path name visible in the lower left corner of the molecular visualization briefly displayed the location on the Reynolds Media server, /presentations investor demo version /simulation Q17 hires MP4. A gasp rippled through the technically adept portion of the audience who recognized the significance of what she had identified, evidence that they were watching a video rather than an actual computing breakthrough. Alexander's expression hardened as he recognized the precision of her attack and its irrefutability. What my wife is attempting, he began, only to be interrupted by Howard Adler rising from his seat. Is the file path name information accurate, Alexander? Howard asked, his venture capitalist's caution now fully activated. Are we watching a simulation rather than actual quantum processing? The question hung in the air, creating the moment of devastating silence Valerie had anticipated in her careful planning. Alexander stood frozen between unsustainable denial and catastrophic admission, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing under the weight of specific, verifiable evidence. The visualization is a representation of the processing capabilities, he finally attempted, falling back on carefully constructed technical ambiguity. It reflects the projected performance of the fully implemented system. That's not what you claimed in your presentation, Rebecca Adler interjected, her scientific training evident in her precise challenge. You specifically stated we were witnessing actual multi-node coherence in real-time processing. The room's atmosphere shifted palpably as investors recognized they had potentially been misled about fundamental technology claims. Valerie remained composed at the center of the storm she had deliberately created, her expression reflecting concern rather than triumph. I believe transparency serves everyone's interests, she stated calmly. Reynolds Technologies has brilliant engineers and legitimate technology potential, but current claims and timelines have diverged significantly from development reality. Equally concerning are the financial structures that have been established alongside the technical misrepresentations. This is absurd, Alexander attempted, though his usual commanding presence had diminished considerably. My wife has no access to company systems or financial information. These claims are completely unfounded. Actually, Cameron Williams intervened, his CFO's instinct for self-preservation evident in his careful distancing. The file path name Dr. Chen, Mrs. Reynolds, identified as accurate. I wasn't aware you had this level of technical background, Valerie. The use of her educational honorific wasn't lost on the room, a subtle but significant acknowledgement of the expertise Alexander had systematically erased from her public identity. More devastating was Cameron's confirmation of her technical observation, effectively validating her credibility while undermining Alexander's attempt to dismiss her claims. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more private setting, suggested Elaine Martinez, the lead counsel for Reynolds Technologies, recognizing the potential legal implications unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses. I agree, Valerie responded reasonably. I've prepared detailed briefing materials for each major investor and board member. She gestured to Helen, who had been watching the unfolding situation with widened eyes, holding a stack of sealed envelopes. These contain specific documentation relevant to your investment positions and fiduciary responsibilities. The strategic brilliance of this move wasn't lost on the experienced business operators in the room. By providing different information to different stakeholders, Valerie had ensured that comparing notes would become an immediate priority, preventing any attempt to collectively dismiss or suppress her disclosures. "I believe we should adjourn the public portion of this evening," Howard Adler announced, taking command of the situation with the authority a significant investment position granted him. "I suggest the board members and principal investors move to the conference facility on the lower level for immediate discussion of these concerns." Alexander stood rigid with contained fury, recognizing the complete derailment of his carefully orchestrated evening and the potential unraveling of the narrative he had spent years constructing. "This is a misunderstanding that I can easily clarify," he attempted, though the confident authority that typically characterized his statements had noticeably diminished. "I'm sure you'll have that opportunity in the discussion to follow," Howard responded diplomatically but firmly. "Valerie, we would appreciate your participation as well, given your evident knowledge of the situations in question." "Of course," she agreed with composed professionalism that contrasted sharply with Alexander's barely contained anger. "I'm committed to ensuring Reynolds Technologies addresses these challenges constructively. The company has legitimate potential that has been undermined by unsustainable claims and concerning financial practices." This framing was deliberate, positioning herself as concerned for the company's welfare rather than vindictively exposing her husband's deceptions. It was a nuance that wouldn't be lost on the sophisticated business operators evaluating not just Alexander's conduct but also Valerie's potential role in whatever came next. As the gathering transitioned from celebration to crisis management, with investors and board members moving toward the private conference facility, Valerie felt Alexander grip her arm with carefully concealed force. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his public charm evaporated now that they were momentarily isolated from direct observation. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" "I've done exactly what was necessary," Valerie replied calmly, disengaging her arm from his grip with subtle but unmistakable firmness. "Reynolds Technologies has extraordinary potential that your misrepresentations and financial manipulations have placed at risk. I'm ensuring the company has a future beyond your unsustainable claims." "You know nothing about running this company," Alexander responded, contempt mixing with desperate anger. "You've been arranging flowers and hosting dinner parties while I've built a billion-dollar enterprise." "That's where you're wrong, Alexander," Valerie countered with calm certainty. "While you've been constructing an increasingly elaborate house of cards, I've been developing actual functioning technology based on the patents I contributed to Reynolds in our early years, technology that works rather than technology you merely claim works." The shock on Alexander's face confirmed what she had suspected. He had never bothered to track her activities beyond the decorative role he had assigned her, never imagined she had continued her technical work in parallel to the society-wide performance he expected. "That's not possible," he managed, though uncertainty had crept into his denial. "Tomorrow's discussion will include a detailed presentation on quantum resonance algorithms I've developed over the past 7 years, Valerie informed him with professional detachment. "Technology that achieves actual distributed coherence through a fundamentally different approach than Reynolds has been attempting. Technology that's been independently verified and patented through a separate entity I established while you assumed I was merely decorating our penthouse as you so often told your colleagues." The color drained from Alexander's face as he processed the comprehensive nature of what was unfolding, not merely exposure of his misrepresentations but the emergence of his systematically underestimated wife as a technical authority with potentially viable alternative technology. "The board would never," he began, but Valerie interrupted with gentle precision. "The term sheet for transitioning my technology into Reynolds is included in the materials I've provided to the investors," she explained. "It offers a legitimate path forward that preserves their investments while addressing the fundamental technical challenges your approach couldn't overcome. Given the alternative of watching their investments collapse under regulatory investigation of your financial manipulations, I suspect they'll find it quite attractive." Before Alexander could respond, Howard Adler approached them. "We're ready to begin the discussion downstairs," he informed them with the careful neutrality of someone reserving judgment until all evidence was presented. "Valerie, would you be willing to walk us through the documentation you've prepared?" "Of course," she agreed with professional composure. "I've organized the material to address both the technical realities and financial concerns, with specific attention to constructive paths forward that preserve the company's legitimate value and potential." As they walked toward the conference facility where Reynolds Technologies' future would be determined, Valerie maintained the poised dignity that had characterized her public persona throughout her marriage. The difference, imperceptible to observers but profoundly meaningful to her, was that this composure now served her own agency rather than Alexander's narrative. 15 years ago, she had set aside her own brilliant career to support what she believed would be a shared vision, only to find herself systematically erased from meaningful contribution and reduced to decorative status. Tonight, the carefully cultivated trophy wife had revealed herself as something Alexander had never bothered to recognize: the most formidable strategic mind in the room and, potentially, his successor in leading the company he had built on promises he couldn't fulfill. The investors and board members awaiting them in the conference room had no way of knowing they were about to witness not merely the exposure of corporate misrepresentation, but the emergence of the woman behind the carefully constructed facade, the transformation of a trophy wife into their potential new CEO. The Artra Building's executive conference facility presented a stark contrast to the celebratory atmosphere of the ballroom above. Gone were the champagne flutes and ambient lighting, replaced by the austere functionality of a space designed for serious corporate deliberation. The long mahogany table surrounded by ergonomic chairs reflected the measured wealth of Reynolds Technologies, impressive enough to reassure investors of the company's success but not so opulent as to suggest frivolous spending of their capital. Valerie took her seat with deliberate calm, positioning herself not beside Alexander as expected of a supportive spouse, but directly across from him, a physical manifestation of the oppositional stance she had just revealed. The symmetry wasn't lost on the gathered board members and investors, who arranged themselves along the table with the careful neutrality of those reserving judgment until all evidence was presented. Alexander attempted to reclaim control of the narrative as the impromptu meeting began, his crisis management training evident in his approach. "I want to address the concerning claims that have been raised," he began, his voice modulated to project both authority and reasonable openness. "While I appreciate my wife's interest in the company's affairs, there appears to be some fundamental misunderstanding of both our technology architecture and standard financial practices in the venture-backed technology sector." Howard Adler, whose Adler Ventures held a 12.7% stake in Reynolds Technologies, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone who had built his fortune by distinguishing substance from performance. "Before we proceed with explanations, I believe it would be valuable to review the specific documentation Valerie has referenced. Given her identification of the file path name, which your CFO has confirmed was accurate, I'm inclined to explore her other observations with appropriate diligence." "I've prepared comprehensive briefing documents for each of you," Valerie stated, nodding to Helen, who began distributing sealed folders to each participant. "These materials are tailored to your specific areas of interest and fiduciary responsibility, though there is naturally some overlap in core content." This methodical approach contrasted sharply with Alexander's attempt at general reassurance, establishing Valerie's command of specific details rather than relying on broadly persuasive rhetoric. The strategic sophistication wasn't lost on the experienced business operators around the table, many of whom were already re-evaluating their assessment of the woman they had previously registered only as Alexander's decorative accompaniment. "The documentation is organized in 3 sections," Valerie continued as the participants opened their folders. "The first addresses the actual technical state of Reynolds Quantum Network versus public and investor claims. The second outlines the financial structures I identified as concerning, including the flow of funds through various entities. The third presents a potential path forward that preserves the company's legitimate value while addressing these fundamental issues." Alexander's expression tightened as he scanned the contents of his folder, recognition dawning that this was not a spontaneous emotional outburst but a meticulously prepared intervention based on months of careful investigation and planning. The tactical asymmetry was now evident. He was responding reactively while Valerie had been strategizing proactively, a reversal of the dynamic he had always assumed defined their relationship. "These technical assessments," began Drive. Sanjay Mehta, the board member with the strongest scientific background, suggest the Reynolds quantum network has achieved coherence across only 3 nodes and for less than 2 seconds under laboratory conditions. That's a dramatic departure from the 17-node stable coherence described in tonight's presentation and in our last 4 quarterly updates. The technical terminology in these assessments is remarkably sophisticated, noted Rebecca Adler, her own scientific training evident in her precise observation. Valerie, your understanding of quantum decoherence challenges and node synchronization limitations suggests far more than casual familiarity with the subject matter. Before becoming Mrs. Reynolds, I completed my doctoral work at Stanford specifically focusing on quantum algorithm optimization for distributed processing environments, Valerie explained, her tone matter-of-fact rather than defensive. My dissertation explored coherence maintenance across non-localized quantum states, essentially the exact challenge Reynolds Technologies has been attempting to solve with its current architecture. The revelation landed heavily around the table, investors and board members reassessing 15 years of interactions during which they had registered Valerie only as Alexander's elegant accessory rather than a highly qualified expert in the very field central to the company's work. That background wasn't included in any of the company or foundation biographical materials I've seen, observed Patricia Wong, representing the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund that had been considering a substantial investment in the upcoming Series E round. No, it wasn't, Valerie acknowledged with composed directness. Early in our marriage, Alexander suggested that highlighting my technical credentials might create confusion about leadership within the company. As time passed, my professional background was systematically omitted from all public-facing materials until I effectively ceased to exist as Dr. Valerie Chen and became merely Mrs. Alexander Reynolds. The subtle but unmistakable indication of systematic erasure wasn't lost on the women in the room, several of whom exchanged knowing glances that communicated shared recognition of a common experience, though perhaps not usually executed with such comprehensive thoroughness. Let's focus on the immediate technical concerns, Alexander attempted, recognizing the dangerous territory into which the conversation was heading. While it's true that our public-facing messaging has been optimistic regarding development timelines, this is standard practice in the technology sector. We present aspirational capabilities to create market positioning while engineering works to close any temporary gaps between promise and delivery. The server logs included on page 7 suggest these aren't temporary gaps but fundamental limitations in your architectural approach, Dr. Mehta countered, his scientific precision cutting through Alexander's carefully constructed ambiguity. The coherence duration hasn't improved meaningfully in 18 months despite approximately $340 million in R&D expenditure during that period. That suggests a plateau in capability rather than a developmental timeline issue. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression Valerie had catalogued hundreds of times when he encountered challenges to his narrative that couldn't be easily dismissed. It was the physical tell that he was recalculating his approach, searching for alternative framing that could maintain his position despite contradictory evidence. The underlying quantum architecture remains sound, he insisted, shifting to technical complexity as a defensive measure. We've encountered scaling challenges that have extended our development timeline, but these represent engineering optimization problems rather than fundamental theoretical limitations. That doesn't align with your own head of quantum architecture's assessment, Howard Adler noted, referring to a document in his folder. This email from Drive, Luthier CTO specifically identifies what he calls insurmountable coherence degradation beyond 3-node implementation with current architectural approach. That language suggests a design limitation rather than merely an engineering optimization challenge. The systematic dismantling of Alexander's narrative was proceeding with the methodical precision Valerie had anticipated in her careful preparation. By providing specific documentary evidence tailored to each participant's area of expertise and interest, she had ensured that challenges would emerge from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing any single line of defense from effectively re-establishing control of the conversation. These technical concerns, while significant, might be addressable through revised development timelines and appropriate investor communication, Cameron Williams attempted, the CFO instinctively moving to contain financial damage. The more pressing issue appears to be the financial structures identified in Section 2 of these materials. This pivot toward the even more problematic financial revelations was inevitable but still visibly unwelcome to Alexander, whose options for plausible deniability were significantly more limited regarding the documented fund transfers than they were for technical development claims. "I'm particularly concerned about these consulting payments," said Patricia Wong, her sovereign wealth fund's meticulous due diligence procedures evident in her immediate focus on the most problematic transactions. Approximately $218 million appears to have been directed to entities that, according to this documentation, trace back to personal holdings rather than actual service providers. That would represent a significant breach of fiduciary responsibility if accurate. "These are legitimate business expenses for specialized services," Alexander insisted, though his typically commanding presence had diminished perceptibly as the conversation progressed. "The corporate structures are complex by necessity to protect proprietary relationships and methodologies. The entity registration documents included here indicate these consulting companies were formed just days before receiving their first payments from Reynolds Technologies," noted Howard Adler, his venture capital experience evident in his immediate recognition of suspicious patterns. "They have no employees, no office locations, no web presence, and no other clients. That's a concerning pattern that typically indicates shell operations rather than legitimate service providers." Alexander's gaze darted to Elaine Martinez, the company's legal counsel, clearly hoping for procedural intervention that might redirect or delay the increasingly damaging discussion. Her slight head-shake in response confirmed what Valerie had already determined in her preparation. The evidence was too specific and well-documented for procedural obstruction to be viable. "Perhaps most concerning," Patricia Wong continued, her analytical precision unrelenting, "is that these entities trace back through multiple layers to personal holding companies where Alexander Reynolds appears to be the sole beneficial owner. If accurate, this would constitute self-dealing of extraordinary magnitude." The room fell silent as the implications settled heavily among the assembled investors and board members. Self-dealing of this nature and scale represented not merely questionable business practice but potentially criminal misappropriation of corporate funds, a much more serious matter than optimistic technological claims. These materials also indicate systematic sale of personal Reynolds Technologies equity holdings during the same period these consulting payments were being processed, Howard Adler noted, turning to another section in his briefing materials. "The pattern suggests preparation for significant corporate valuation adjustment, essentially positioning for personal financial security regardless of company outcome." The tactical brilliance of Valerie's approach was becoming increasingly evident. By providing different but overlapping information to each participant, she had created a situation in which they were collectively assembling a comprehensive picture of concerning activities, with each new observation reinforcing and extending the emerging narrative of systematic misrepresentation and potential misappropriation. "Before we proceed further with these allegations," Alexander attempted, his voice tighter than his usual controlled delivery, "I believe it would be appropriate to discuss this privately with the board rather than in this expanded forum. These are complex matters that require careful contextual understanding. Given that multiple major investors are present and directly affected by these concerns, I believe continued transparency serves everyone's interests," Valerie countered smoothly, her measured response undermining Alexander's attempt to limit the discussion. "Particularly since the third section of the materials presents a constructive path forward that potentially preserves significant value for all stakeholders." This strategic redirection toward potential solutions rather than merely problems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both investor psychology and crisis management, establishing Valerie as solution-oriented rather than vengefully destructive, despite the devastating nature of her revelations. "I'm particularly interested in this alternative technological approach," Dr. Mehta noted, turning to the final section of his briefing materials. "These technical specifications suggest a fundamentally different method for maintaining quantum coherence across distributed nodes, one that appears to address the limitation plateaus encountered in the current Reynolds architecture." "Yes," Valerie confirmed with professional precision that contrasted sharply with Alexander's increasingly defensive posture. "Rather than pursuing brute force coherence maintenance through environmental isolation, this approach utilizes resonant quantum states across entangled particle groups. It sacrifices some theoretical processing speed for dramatic improvements in coherent stability and node scalability. The technical discussion had now shifted entirely away from Alexander to Valerie, a transformation in perceived expertise and authority that would have been unimaginable to the assembled group just hours earlier. The woman they had registered only as an elegant accessory was now commanding the detailed technical conversation about quantum computing architectures with evident expertise. These test results, Dr. Mehta continued, examining the documentation with growing interest, suggest you've achieved stable 9-node coherence with this alternative approach. That would represent significant advancement beyond the 3-node limitation in the current Reynolds architecture. The test results have been independently verified by quantum computing research teams at both MIT and Cambridge, Valerie confirmed, the reasonable modesty in her tone more convincing than any aggressive claims would have been. The architecture still requires substantial engineering refinement before commercial implementation, but the fundamental approach appears to overcome the coherence limitations that have plateaued development in the current Reynolds technology. Alexander's expression had transformed from controlled concern to barely concealed alarm as he recognized the comprehensive nature of Valerie's alternative position. She had not merely exposed the company's misrepresentations and his financial manipulations. She had simultaneously presented a viable alternative technology that addressed the very limitations that had necessitated those misrepresentations in the first place. This alternative technology, Howard Adler noted, turning to the final pages of his briefing materials, appears to be owned by Chen Quantum Systems rather than Reynolds Technologies. I'm not familiar with this entity. Chen Quantum Systems is a private research entity I established 7 years ago, Valerie explained with composed professionalism. Given my effective exclusion from meaningful participation in Reynolds Technologies despite my relevant expertise, I continued my research independently while maintaining my expected role as Alexander's supportive spouse. The calculated precision of this long-term parallel development wasn't lost on the experienced business operators around the table. Many were mentally reassessing every interaction they had ever had with Valerie, recognizing now that behind her gracious smiles and perfect hostess performance had been a methodical mind executing a sophisticated long-term strategy. The term sheet included in Section 3, Valerie continued, directing attention to the final pages of the briefing materials, outlines a potential integration of Chen Quantum Systems architecture and intellectual property into Reynolds Technologies through appropriate licensing or acquisition structure. This would provide the company with viable technology to deliver on its quantum computing promises while addressing the current limitations that have necessitated increasingly problematic misrepresentations. The strategic sophistication of this proposal, offering a solution simultaneously with exposing the problems, demonstrated business acumen that further contradicted the trophy wife image Alexander had so carefully constructed around her. Rather than merely destroying what he had built, she was offering a legitimate path forward that could preserve significant value despite the revealed misrepresentations. This is absurd, Alexander finally managed, his carefully cultivated CEO persona cracking under the comprehensive dismantling of his position. You can't possibly have developed viable quantum computing technology while planning dinner parties and redecorating our penthouse. That assumption, Valerie replied with calm that contrasted sharply with his growing agitation, exemplifies precisely how this parallel development remained undetected. Your absolute certainty that my capabilities extended only to social functions and interior design created the perfect cover for substantive technical work. You never bothered to investigate what I was actually doing because you were so convinced it couldn't possibly be important. The psychological reversal was now complete. Alexander's dismissive underestimation of his wife had created the very blind spot through which she had executed her meticulous strategy. The trophy wife narrative he had constructed had become the perfect cover for the development of both damning evidence and viable alternative technology. These Chen Quantum Systems patent filings, noted Rebecca Adler, examining the technical documentation with evident expertise, date back approximately 7 years but show clear evolution of the resonant quantum state approach. The methodical development timeline suggests sustained research rather than recent fabrication. My work began as theoretical exploration, Valerie explained, her technical precision further establishing her credibility in direct contradiction to Alexander's dismissive characterization. As the limitations in the Reynolds approach became increasingly evident through Alexander's private admissions at home, comments he made freely, believing I couldn't possibly understand their technical implications, I focused my research specifically on addressing those constraints through alternative architectural approaches. This revelation that Alexander had essentially provided ongoing intelligence about Reynolds Technologies' developmental challenges to his wife, whom he had underestimated so completely that he spoke freely about technical matters in her presence, landed heavily around the table. Several board members exchanged glances that communicated recognition of how thoroughly Alexander's arrogance had compromised his position. "I've had enough of this charade," Alexander declared, standing abruptly with the physical manifestation of his evaporating control. "I built Reynolds Technologies from nothing into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I won't sit here and have my achievements undermined by my wife's vindictive fabrications." "The evidence presented isn't fabrication, Alexander," Howard Adler replied with the calm certainty of someone who had reviewed enough documentation to form a definitive assessment. "The technical limitations are verified by your own team's internal communications. The financial transfers are documented in corporate records. And the alternative technology has been independently validated by respected research institutions." "Furthermore," added Patricia Wong, her sovereign wealth fund's meticulous standards evident in her precise observation, "Dr. Chen's approach to this situation demonstrates commitment to preserving legitimate company value despite the identified misrepresentations. That suggests constructive intent rather than vindictive motivation." The strategic sophistication of Valerie's approach was now fully evident to the assembled investors and board members. By simultaneously exposing problems and offering solutions, by providing evidence of misrepresentation alongside pathways for value preservation, she had established herself as the rational actor in the unfolding drama while Alexander's increasingly emotional responses undermined his carefully cultivated image of visionary leadership. "Given the gravity of these concerns," Howard Adler stated, addressing the board members directly, "I believe immediate governance action is required to stabilize the situation and protect the company's vital assets while these matters are thoroughly investigated." "I agree," Patricia Wong concurred, the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund's substantial potential investment giving particular weight to her assessment. "Fiduciary responsibility requires appropriate response to documented concerns of this magnitude, particularly regarding the financial transactions identified in these materials." Alexander watched with barely controlled fury as the conversation shifted from questioning Valerie's revelations to determining appropriate governance response, a transitional moment signaling that her evidence had been deemed sufficiently credible to warrant action rather than merely further investigation. "I move that we temporarily relieve Alexander Reynolds of his operational responsibilities as CEO pending comprehensive investigation of these concerns," stated James Harrison, the lead independent director whose governance experience made him particularly attentive to proper procedural management of the unfolding crisis. "The board should establish an independent special committee to oversee this investigation with appropriate external counsel and forensic accounting support." "I second the motion," Dr. Mehta added promptly, his scientific background making him particularly responsive to evidence of technical misrepresentation. Alexander's expression transformed from anger to disbelief as he recognized the rapid collapse of his authority. "This is outrageous," he protested, though his typically commanding presence had diminished dramatically as the evidence against him accumulated. "You can't possibly take these allegations seriously without proper investigation." "That's precisely what we're establishing, proper investigation," James Harrison replied with the measured certainty of experienced governance. "Given the specificity of the documentation presented, appropriate fiduciary response requires temporary leadership transition while these matters are thoroughly examined." "I call for an immediate vote on the motion," Howard Adler stated, his venture capital firm's substantial investment giving particular weight to his procedural intervention. Valerie observed the unfolding governance process with composed neutrality that revealed nothing of her internal response to seeing 15 years of systematic diminishment potentially reversed in a single evening. Her careful planning had anticipated this moment, had strategically engineered it through the precise calibration of evidence, timing, and presentation, But the human reality of witnessing Alexander's carefully constructed narrative collapse still carried emotional complexity beyond strategic satisfaction. All in favor of temporarily relieving Alexander Reynolds of his CEO responsibilities pending investigation of the concerns presented this evening, James Harrison called, conducting the impromptu board vote with appropriate procedural formality despite the unusual circumstances. Hands rose around the table, first Dr. Mehta, then Patricia Wong in her capacity as board observer representing major investors, followed by 3 additional board members in rapid succession. Only Cameron Williams and Elaine Martinez kept their hands down, their hesitation reflecting their close professional alignment with Alexander rather than any evident doubt about the documented concerns. "The motion carries," James Harrison declared with the formal certainty of proper governance procedure. Alexander Reynolds is temporarily relieved of his operational responsibilities as CEO of Reynolds Technologies effective immediately, pending comprehensive investigation of the concerns presented regarding technical misrepresentation and potentially improper financial transactions. Alexander stood rigid with contained fury, watching as his 15 years of carefully constructed authority collapsed under the weight of meticulously documented evidence. "You'll regret this," he stated, addressing the board collectively but focusing his gaze on Valerie with particular intensity. "When this vindictive fabrication is exposed, the damage to the company will be irreparable." "The evidence presented isn't fabrication, Alexander," Howard Adler repeated with calm certainty. "The appropriate response is thorough investigation rather than defensive dismissal. If these concerns prove unfounded, your position will be restored with appropriate recognition of any temporary disruption." In the interim, James Harrison continued, maintaining proper governance procedure despite the emotionally charged atmosphere. "We need to establish appropriate temporary leadership to ensure operational continuity during the investigation period." The pivotal moment Valerie had anticipated in her careful planning had arrived. The transition from exposing problems to potentially implementing solutions, from dismantling Alexander's position to establishing her own. Her composed expression revealed nothing of the strategic calculation occurring behind her carefully maintained professional demeanor. Given the technical nature of the company's core business and the specific concerns raised regarding technology misrepresentation, Dr. Mehta suggested with careful consideration, it would seem appropriate to appoint leadership with sufficient technical expertise to accurately assess current capabilities and limitations. "I agree," Patricia Wong concurred, her sovereign wealth fund's investment considerations clearly factoring into her assessment. Temporary leadership should combine technical understanding with commitment to transparent investor communication, essentially addressing the specific governance failures that created the situation. Valerie maintained her composed neutrality as the conversation progressed toward leadership consideration, neither actively promoting herself nor appearing to shrink from the potential responsibility. This calibrated approach, demonstrating neither ambitious grasping nor false modesty, reflected sophisticated understanding of how to navigate this delicate transitional moment. "Dr. Chen," Howard Adler addressed Valerie directly, using her academic title rather than her married name in subtle but significant acknowledgement of her independent professional identity. "Your technical background and evident understanding of both the current Reynolds architecture and potential alternative approaches suggests you might be appropriately qualified for temporary leadership during this investigation period. Would you be willing to consider such a role?" The question hung in the air with weight beyond its immediate governance implications. It represented potential reversal of 15 years of systematic professional error. The trophy wife suddenly recognized as potentially the most qualified technical leader to guide the company through its current crisis. "My primary concern is ensuring Reynolds Technologies addresses its current challenges constructively," Valerie replied with measured consideration that avoided appearing either eagerly opportunistic or falsely reluctant. "I believe the company has legitimate potential that has been undermined by unsustainable claims and concerning financial practices. If the board believes my technical background and understanding of these specific issues would be useful during this transition period, I would be willing to provide that assistance." Alexander's expression reflected stunned disbelief as he watched his carefully constructed narrative not merely collapse but potentially invert. The wife he had systematically positioned as decorative accessory now being considered as his replacement. The comprehensive nature of this reversal appeared to exceed even his worst assessment of the unfolding situation. I move that we appoint Dr. Valerie Chen as Acting Chief Executive Officer of Reynolds Technologies during the investigation period, James Harrison stated, formalizing the consideration into proper governance procedure. Her technical background, familiarity with the specific concerns under investigation, and demonstrated commitment to addressing these issues constructively suggests appropriate qualifications for this temporary leadership role. I second the motion, Dr. Mehta added promptly, his scientific appreciation for Valerie's technical credentials evident in his immediate support. This is absolutely outrageous, Alexander interjected, his typical composure now completely abandoned. You cannot possibly appoint my wife as my replacement based on a single evening of unverified allegations. This is clearly a coordinated hostile action that violates all proper governance procedure. The board is exercising appropriate fiduciary responsibility based on specific, documented concerns regarding company leadership, James Harrison replied with a measured certainty of experienced governance. The temporary appointment represents reasonable business judgment given the technical nature of the issues under investigation and Dr. Chen's evident qualifications in precisely those domains. I call for an immediate vote on the motion, Howard Adler stated, bringing the discussion back to formal procedure despite Alexander's continuing objections. Valerie maintained her composed professionalism as the impromptu vote proceeded, her expression revealing nothing of the extraordinary reversal unfolding, from systematically erased trophy wife to potential CEO in a single evening of carefully orchestrated revelation. All in favor of appointing Dr. Valerie Chen as Acting Chief Executive Officer pending completion of the investigation into the concerns presented this evening, James Harrison called, conducting the board vote with appropriate formality. Hands rose around the table, first Dr. Mehta, then Howard Adler, followed by Patricia Wong and 3 additional board members in sequence. Cameron Williams and Elaine Martinez again kept their hands down, their professional alignment with Alexander evidently outweighing the documented concerns despite the compelling evidence presented. The motion carries, James Harrison declared with formal certainty. Dr. Valerie Chen is appointed Acting Chief Executive Officer of Reynolds Technologies effective immediately, pending completion of the comprehensive investigation into the concerns regarding technical misrepresentation and potentially improper financial transactions. The governance reversal was now complete. The trophy wife had been formally appointed to replace her husband as CEO of the company he had built his identity around leading. Alexander stood rigid with contained fury, the comprehensive dismantling of his carefully constructed narrative evidently exceeding his worst assessment of the unfolding situation. This is not over, he stated with quiet intensity that suggested calculation rather than merely emotional reaction. When the full facts emerge, this coordinated attack will be recognized for what it actually represents. The investigation will determine the facts, Alexander, Howard Adler replied with measured certainty. If the concerns prove unfounded, appropriate corrections will follow. But the specific documentation presented demands proper fiduciary response regardless of personal considerations. Alexander gathered his materials with deliberate control that suggested strategic retreat rather than defeated withdrawal. I'll be consulting with personal counsel regarding this improper governance action, he informed the board with cold precision. Expect formal communication regarding appropriate process for addressing these fabricated concerns. As Alexander exited the conference room, the atmospheric shift was palpable. 15 years of his dominant personality and carefully curated authority suddenly absent from a corporate environment he had fundamentally shaped through his vision and leadership, however flawed the execution had ultimately proven. Dr. Chen, James Harrison addressed Valerie directly once Alexander had departed. As acting CEO, your immediate priority should be stabilizing operations while the investigation proceeds. The board will establish the special committee immediately to ensure appropriate governance of both the investigation process and interim leadership. I understand, Valerie acknowledged with professional focus that reinforced the board's assessment of her capabilities beyond the revelations that had precipitated this extraordinary transition. My immediate focus will be on conducting accurate technology assessment to determine actual development status versus public claims, reviewing financial operations to identify any additional concerns, and establishing transparent communication with key stakeholders regarding the company's actual position and prospects. This precise articulation of appropriate priorities, addressing the specific issues that had necessitated leadership transition rather than implementing broader agenda, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of her proper role as acting CEO during this interim period. It reinforced the board's assessment that she represented stabilizing rather than disruptive leadership despite the extraordinary circumstances of her appointment. We should prepare for significant market response when this transition becomes public, observed Patricia Wong, her sovereign wealth fund's market sensitivity evident in her immediate consideration of external reaction. The company will need to issue carefully calibrated disclosure that addresses the leadership change without creating unnecessary market disruption. I'll work with legal counsel to draft appropriate disclosure that balances transparency requirements with business continuity considerations, Valerie responded, her measured approach to this complex communication challenge further establishing her as potentially stabilizing rather than merely disruptive leadership. As the discussion transitioned to practical implementation of the extraordinary governance actions just taken, Valerie maintained her composed professional focus, revealing nothing of her internal response to this remarkable reversal of the dynamic that had defined her marriage and professional identity for 15 years. The trophy wife was now acting CEO, leading the very company from which she had been systematically excluded despite irrelevant expertise. The husband who had carefully constructed a narrative of her decorative irrelevance was now removed from operational control of the enterprise central to his identity and wealth. The investors who had registered her only as Alexander's elegant accessory were now entrusting her with protecting their billions in capital during a period of extraordinary corporate vulnerability. What none of them yet fully appreciated, though the evening's revelations had provided initial glimpse, was that this outcome represented not spontaneous opportunity but the culmination of years of careful planning, methodical evidence gathering, and strategic patience. The trophy wife had revealed herself as the most sophisticated strategic operator in the room, executing a multi-year plan with precision that had culminated in this extraordinary governance reversal. As the meeting concluded with procedural details regarding the formal implementation of the board's decisions, Valerie allowed herself a brief moment of recognition regarding what she had accomplished. 15 years of systematic diminishment had been dramatically reversed through carefully orchestrated revelation, transforming her from decorative accessory to corporate leadership in a single evening of meticulously planned intervention. The investors and board members who had previously dismissed her as merely Alexander's beautiful wife were now approaching her with the deference typically reserved for substantive corporate leadership, a transformation in perceived status so dramatic it created almost visible cognitive dissonance as they adjusted their fundamental assessment of someone they had misjudged so completely for so long. Dr. Chen, Howard Adler addressed her as the meeting dispersed. I believe tomorrow morning would be appropriate for initial discussion regarding potential integration of your alternative quantum architecture into Reynolds Technologies. If your technology delivers capabilities as documented in these materials, it could represent significant value preservation despite the current governance challenges. I'll make myself available at your convenience, Valerie agreed with professional courtesy that revealed nothing of the strategic vindication this conversation represented. The venture capitalist who had previously registered her only as Alexander's decorative accompaniment now engaging with her as technical innovator and corporate leader. As she gathered her materials following this extraordinary governance session, Valerie maintained the composed dignity that had characterized her public persona throughout her marriage. The difference, imperceptible to observers but profoundly meaningful to her, was that this composure now served her own leadership rather than Alexander's narrative. The trophy wife had engineered her transformation into CEO through years of patient strategic execution culminating in a single evening of carefully orchestrated revelation. The ultimate irony, one that Alexander himself had yet to fully comprehend, was that a systematic underestimation of her capabilities had created the very conditions that enabled her methodical accumulation of both damning evidence and vital alternative technology. Tomorrow would bring extraordinary challenges as acting CEO during corporate crisis, addressing technical misrepresentations, investigating financial improprieties, communicating with stakeholders regarding governance transition, and potentially implementing her alternative quantum architecture to preserve legitimate company value despite Alexander's systematic deceptions. But for this brief moment between orchestrated revelation and operational implementation, Valerie allowed herself to acknowledge the extraordinary reversal she had engineered, the trophy wife becoming CEO, the decorative accessory revealing herself as technical innovator, The systematically diminished spouse replacing her husband as corporate leader through carefully executed strategy rather than mere opportunistic reaction. The investors who had gathered to celebrate Alexander's technological vision and 15 years of marriage to his perfect trophy were now dispersing after appointing that supposedly decorative wife as his replacement, a transformation so complete in its reversal that its psychological impact would likely register fully only in the days and weeks to come. As Valerie prepared to depart the conference facility as newly appointed acting CEO rather than merely Alexander's accompanying spouse, she recognized that this governance reversal represented only the beginning of the next strategic phase rather than culmination of her carefully orchestrated intervention. The trophy wife had revealed herself as CEO. Now she would need to demonstrate that her leadership capabilities matched the strategic sophistication that had engineered this extraordinary transformation, that she could deliver the technical innovation and corporate transparency she had positioned as alternative to Alexander's increasingly unsustainable combination of misrepresentation and manipulation. The challenge that awaited her was substantial but represented precisely the opportunity she had methodically created through years of patient planning and strategic execution. The decorative wife had engineered her emergence as corporate leader through the most comprehensive strategic reversal the assembled investors had ever witnessed, the trophy transforming herself into CEO through carefully orchestrated revelation of both problems and solutions. The Artra building looked remarkably different in morning light, its gleaming glass exterior reflecting the sunrise rather than the carefully manipulated lighting that had characterized the previous evening's anniversary celebration. Valerie observed this transformation from the executive car that had collected her promptly at 7:30 a.m. from the Four Seasons suite she had reserved 3 weeks earlier, another element of her meticulous contingency planning. Unlike Alexander, who required at least 90 minutes of carefully orchestrated preparation before any significant corporate appearance, she had been awake since 5 a.m. reviewing additional documentation and preparing for the day's critical discussions. The 14 hours since the emergency board meeting had witnessed extraordinary corporate mobilization. Her secure phone had received 17 updates from special committee members coordinating with Reynolds Technologies senior executives to implement the emergency governance protocols established during last night's intervention. The carefully constructed corporate hierarchy that had channeled all substantive authority through Alexander had been temporarily replaced by committee-based decision structures that distributed responsibility among previously marginalized executives. Most interesting were the text messages from development team leaders expressing cautious optimism about the potential integration of Valerie's quantum resonance technology. Their technical assessment reflected genuine excitement about working with methodologies that might actually deliver the capabilities Alexander had been promising without viable implementation pathway. These spontaneous expressions of professional enthusiasm represented validation far more significant than the governance intervention itself, recognition from technical peers rather than merely administrative authority. As she entered the executive lobby that had previously acknowledged her only as Alexander's decorative appendage, Valerie noted the subtle shift in personnel response. Security staff who had typically offered vague pleasantries now demonstrated attentive respect. Reception personnel who had previously directed her towards social functions now escorted her to substantive corporate locations. The transformation reflected not merely the emergency governance intervention but more fundamental recognition of her previously unacknowledged capabilities. Dr. Chen, Howard Adler greeted her as she entered the executive conference suite, his use of her professional title rather than marital designation another manifestation of the perception shift that had occurred overnight. Thank you for joining us so early. The special committee has been in session since 6 coordinating the immediate stabilization protocols. I hope you've had some rest despite the circumstances, Valerie responded with genuine consideration that characterized her interpersonal approach despite the extraordinary situation. Governance transitions require substantial energy alongside technical expertise. Howard nodded with appreciation for this human acknowledgement amid the corporate crisis. Coffee has been my primary sustenance, he admitted with the rueful smile of someone who had spent decades navigating high-stakes corporate situations. But the immediate challenges are energizing in their own way. The conference room had been transformed from the previous evening's emergency session into an operational command center, multiple display screens showing financial data, development team status, and external media monitoring. Janet Rivera and 3 other board members representing the special committee were arranged around the table alongside key executives who had been brought into the intervention process overnight. Valerie, Dr. Chen, Janet corrected herself, another indication of the fundamental perception shift. We've been implementing the stabilization protocols established last night while preparing for more comprehensive assessment of both the concerns you've raised and the potential integration opportunity you've presented. Perhaps most immediately relevant, we've secured the financial systems and implemented the emergency review procedures outlined in your governance remediation proposal. This reference to documentation Valerie had provided reflected another aspect of her comprehensive preparation, having developed not merely evidence of misconduct but practical frameworks for addressing the resulting governance challenges. Where others might have focused solely on exposure, she had anticipated the constructive requirements that would follow any effective intervention. The preliminary review has confirmed approximately $42 million in questionable transfers through the consulting entities you identified, Janet continued, displaying financial analysis on the central screen. We've implemented immediate freeze on all related accounts pending comprehensive forensic examination by independent auditors who arrived at 3 a.m. from Deloitte's Special Investigations Division. The swift implementation of financial controls represented appropriate governance response to the evidence Valerie had presented, protecting corporate assets while establishing proper investigative process for addressing the irregular transactions. The special committee's effectiveness in executing these immediate protective measures reflected both the compelling nature of our documentation and their own recognition of fiduciary responsibility once the concerning patterns had been revealed. "Where is Alexander this morning?" Valerie inquired, noting his absence from the operational center despite no formal removal from his position beyond the temporary authority suspension. He attempted to enter the building at approximately 6:15 a.m. with outside legal counsel, Howard explained with careful neutrality. Given the potential evidence preservation concerns, we implemented the secure access protocols outlined in the emergency governance procedures, limiting his physical access to systems and documentation while maintaining appropriate communication channels through corporate counsel. This measured response reflected sophisticated crisis management, establishing necessary protective boundaries without creating additional legal vulnerability through potentially excessive restrictions. Alexander's attempt to bring outside counsel into corporate headquarters suggested he was already preparing legal challenge to the governance intervention rather than cooperating with the investigative process the board had initiated. "We anticipate he'll pursue aggressive response through both legal and shareholder channels," Howard continued, acknowledging the reality of founder resistance without appearing unduly concerned. Corporate counsel is preparing for potential injunctive actions while investor relations has implemented the communication strategy outlined in your stabilization documentation. This reference to another aspect of Valerie's comprehensive preparation reflected her anticipation of Alexander's likely countermeasures, having provided strategic frameworks for addressing the governance, legal, and shareholder dimensions of resistance to necessary oversight intervention. Her methodical approach had extended beyond mere exposure to include practical pathway for navigating the complex aftermath of corporate governance revolution. The most immediate operational priority involves technological assessment and potential integration planning, Howard continued, transitioning to the constructive dimensions rather than merely protective measures. Your proposal regarding quantum resonance methodology presents potential solution to the fundamental technical challenges facing Reynolds Technologies, but comprehensive evaluation will be required before formal determination regarding integration pathway. This careful framing established appropriate corporate process while maintaining the possibility of the solution Valerie had strategically presented, neither prematurely committing to her proposal nor dismissing it despite its connection to the whistleblowing that had precipitated the crisis. "I've anticipated that requirement," Valerie acknowledged, opening her portfolio to extract a comprehensive technical documentation package. This contains independent verification data from the Princeton Quantum Institute, full architectural specifications for the resonance stabilization methodology, and comparative analysis demonstrating compatibility with Reynolds Technologies' existing infrastructure despite the fundamental approach differences. The meticulous technical documentation reflected the same comprehensive preparation that had characterized her governance intervention, anticipating the substantive evaluation requirements that would follow initial disclosure rather than merely presenting conceptual alternatives without implementation pathway. Several executives exchanged impressed glances that acknowledged the sophisticated forethought underlying her approach to both problem identification and potential resolution. Dr. Patel from Princeton has made himself available for independent consultation regarding the verification protocols they conducted last month, Valerie added, providing another layer of credibility to her technological alternative. He can offer unbiased assessment of both the methodology's current capabilities and its scaling potential relative to the coherence challenges Reynolds has been encountering with the isolation approach. This provision of independent expert validation represented another strategic element of her comprehensive preparation, establishing objective verification pathways rather than merely asserting superior technical approach. The special committee members nodded with appreciation for this thoughtful facilitation of their due diligence responsibilities. I've taken liberty of preparing a senior technical team briefing that could be conducted this afternoon if deemed appropriate, Valerie continued, anticipating the human dimensions of technological transition alongside the technical requirements. The presentation addresses both the theoretical foundations of the resonance approach and its practical implementation implications, with specific attention to preserving the valuable components of Reynolds' existing development while redirecting efforts toward more viable methodologies. This consideration of development team psychology alongside technical requirements reflected sophisticated leadership thinking beyond mere problem identification or technical solution, addressing the human factors that would ultimately determine successful implementation regardless of theoretical superiority or governance mandate. Howard and Janet exchanged approving glances that acknowledged this thoughtful dimension of her approach to potential corporate transformation. That would be extremely helpful, Howard confirmed. We've scheduled comprehensive technical team briefing for 2 p.m. today. The communication focus has been on governance stabilization rather than technological redirection thus far, but establishing viable pathway forward will be crucial for maintaining team confidence and preventing talent departure as awareness of the actual development status spreads within the organization. This practical concern reflected sophisticated understanding of the human implications underlying corporate crisis, recognizing that technical personnel would require credible pathway forward rather than merely governance intervention if their commitment to the organization was to be maintained during tumultuous transition. Valerie nodded with appreciation for this thoughtful consideration of implementation realities beyond formal governance processes. Before we proceed with technical assessment, Janet interjected with a careful precision that characterized her audit committee leadership. I believe we should address the financial implications of potential integration more explicitly. The term sheet presented last night outlined general framework for technology transfer, but more detailed modeling will be required for proper fiduciary evaluation. This appropriate focus on financial dimensions alongside technological assessment reflected the balanced governance approach necessary for comprehensive corporate decision-making. Valerie had anticipated this requirement in her preparation and responded accordingly. I've prepared detailed financial modeling for 3 potential integration scenarios, she explained, extracting another document from her seemingly bottomless portfolio of meticulously organized materials. The analysis includes development timeline implications, resource requirements, and projected commercialization pathways under varying implementation approaches. The comprehensive financial documentation reflected sophisticated business understanding alongside technical expertise, addressing the economic dimensions of technological integration rather than merely focusing on capability differences. The special committee members reviewed the detailed projections with evident appreciation for this multidimensional approach to potential corporate transformation, most immediately relevant given the cash flow concerns identified in last night's disclosure. Valerie continued, anticipating the pressing financial realities beyond governance and technological considerations. The bridge financing commitment from Quantum Resonance Systems' existing investors remains available for immediate implementation if the special committee determines appropriate pathway forward. This practical provision for immediate financial stabilization represented another dimension of her comprehensive preparation, addressing the urgent liquidity requirements that would likely emerge once the full extent of Reynolds Technologies' technological and financial challenges became apparent through proper governance assessment. The special committee members nodded with appreciation for this thoughtful consideration of immediate corporate welfare alongside longer-term transformation possibilities. We should also address the public disclosure dimensions, Howard noted, transitioning to another critical aspect of crisis management. Reynolds Technologies has substantial public profile given Alexander's media presence and the company's positioning as technological leader. Appropriate communication strategy will be essential for maintaining stakeholder confidence while fulfilling disclosure obligations. This consideration of external perception alongside internal governance reflected sophisticated understanding of the multidimensional challenges facing the company during turbulent transition. Valerie had anticipated this requirement as well. Extracting another document from her portfolio, I've outlined potential disclosure framework that balances transparency requirements with appropriate protection of legitimate shareholder interests, she explained, providing the communication strategy document to committee members. The approach acknowledges governance concerns requiring immediate attention while emphasizing constructive transformation rather than merely cataloging historical issues. The carefully calibrated disclosure strategy reflected sophisticated understanding of both legal requirements and market psychology, addressing necessary transparency without creating undue market disruption through excessively negative framing. The special committee members reviewed the proposed approach with evident appreciation for its thoughtful balance between competing considerations. This is remarkably comprehensive, Janet acknowledged, expressing what several committee members clearly felt about Valerie's multidimensional preparation. The contrast between this methodical approach to corporate challenges and what we've experienced under previous leadership is notable. The diplomatic understatement nevertheless conveyed profound reassessment of relative capabilities, comparing Valerie's systematic problem-solving methodology with Alexander's charismatic but ultimately inadequate leadership approach. Other committee members nodded with similar recognition of the fundamental competence differential that had been revealed through the governance intervention process. One dimension we haven't explicitly addressed, Howard noted, introducing the leadership question that had been implicit throughout the morning's discussion, is the operational authority structure moving forward. The special committee has temporary governance mandate during investigation and assessment, but sustainable leadership framework will be required for successful implementation of whatever technological and financial direction emerges from this process. This careful introduction of the leadership question reflected sophisticated governance consideration, acknowledging the necessary evolution from emergency intervention to sustainable organizational structure without prematurely resolving complex succession questions amid ongoing assessment. Valerie recognized this as the strategic opening it represented but maintained professional focus on corporate welfare rather than personal advancement. I believe technological and financial stabilization should take priority over permanent leadership determination, she responded with measured consideration that demonstrated genuine commitment to organizational health beyond personal positioning. Establishing viable development pathway and securing necessary financial resources represent immediate requirements that precede formal leadership designation. This thoughtful prioritization reflected sophisticated organizational understanding, focusing on substantive corporate needs rather than governance formalities despite the implicit leadership opportunity the situation presented. The special committee members exchanged approving glances that acknowledged this principled approach to potential advancement opportunity. That said, Valerie continued with characteristic precision, I'm prepared to serve in whatever capacity the board determines would best support Reynolds Technologies' legitimate interests during this transition period and beyond. My primary concern remains establishing sustainable technological foundation and appropriate governance framework rather than specific title or authority designation. This carefully framed availability represented perfect balance between appropriate ambition and genuine corporate service, offering leadership capability without demanding specific position or appearing to exploit crisis for personal advancement. The special committee members nodded with evident appreciation for this thoughtful approach to the implicit leadership question underlying the governance intervention. I believe immediate focus on the technical team briefing this afternoon represents appropriate next step, Howard concluded, establishing practical priority without prematurely resolving the leadership question his earlier comment had introduced. Stabilizing the development organization through credible technological pathway will address one of the most pressing concerns while additional assessment proceeds regarding financial remediation and governance structure. This sensible prioritization reflected sophisticated crisis management, addressing immediate operational requirements while establishing process for resolving longer-term structural questions. The committee members and executives nodded agreement with this approach, recognizing the importance of maintaining development team confidence amid the governance transformation. As the morning session transitioned toward preparation for the technical briefing, Valerie's phone buzzed with notification she had been anticipating, a message from Alexander delivered through his newly retained outside counsel rather than direct communication. Emergency shareholder action being prepared to reverse illegitimate board intervention. Opportunity for amicable resolution remains available through mutual statement acknowledging misunderstanding and withdrawing unsubstantiated allegations. Respond through counsel within 3 hours to avoid irreversible escalation. The transparent attempt at intimidation reflected exactly the response pattern Valerie had anticipated in her strategic planning, leveraging founder shareholder position to threaten governance reversal while simultaneously offering face-saving resolution that would effectively nullify the intervention without addressing underlying misconduct. She shared the message with Howard and Janet, whose expressions reflected recognition of the predictable founder resistance pattern without undue concern regarding its effectiveness. Corporate counsel anticipated this approach, Howard noted with the calm confidence of someone who had navigated similar founder challenges throughout his venture capital career. The shareholder agreement contains governance provisions that prevent emergency removal of board members without supermajority approval specifically to protect against this type of reactive intervention. Alexander requires support from investors representing 66% of external capital to override last night's committee formation, which appears highly unlikely given the documentation provided to key investment partners. This structural protection represented another aspect of corporate governance that Valerie had carefully researched during her months of preparation, understanding the specific shareholder agreement provisions that would prevent Alexander from simply leveraging his founder stock position to reverse necessary oversight intervention. The special committee's confidence in these protective measures reflected their own sophisticated understanding of the corporate structure they were now navigating with newly informed perspective. I'd recommend acknowledging receipt of communication through corporate counsel while proceeding with planned technical briefing and assessment process, Janet suggested, demonstrating the calm professionalism that characterized the committee's approach to Alexander's resistance. Engagement with unproductive negotiation would simply delay necessary evaluation of both the concerns raised and potential integration opportunity presented. This measured response reflected appropriate governance focus on substantive corporate welfare rather than reactive engagement with intimidation tactics. Valerie nodded agreement with this approach, her composed reaction to Alexander's threatened escalation contrasting sharply with the emotional volatility that might have characterized less strategic whistleblowing. The technical briefing preparation should take priority, she agreed, maintaining focus on constructive next steps rather than defensive response to threatened countermeasures. Development team stabilization represents immediate requirement regardless of governance resolution, especially given the questions that have likely emerged overnight as awareness of the actual technological status spreads within the organization. This prioritization reflected sophisticated understanding of organizational psychology alongside corporate governance, recognizing that technical personnel would require a credible pathway forward regardless of leadership structure or shareholder dynamics. The special committee members nodded appreciation for this thoughtful consideration of human factors beyond formal governance processes. As the morning session concluded with practical planning for the afternoon's technical briefing, Valerie received another unexpected communication, this one from Lisa Chen, head of neural network optimization within Reynolds Technologies Development Organization. Several of us saw your name on the technical briefing announcement and researched your background overnight. Your 2017 paper on resonance stabilization approaches to quantum coherence has been underground reading in our department for months. Looking forward to hearing directly from the author rather than watching another simulation presented as actual functionality. This spontaneous outreach from technical personnel represented validation completely separate from governance intervention or leadership dynamics, peer recognition of her substantive expertise despite years of systematic marginalization within corporate narrative. Valerie allowed herself momentary satisfaction at this organic acknowledgement before returning to preparation for the afternoon's critical presentation. The hours between morning governance session and afternoon technical briefing witnessed continued corporate mobilization across multiple dimensions. Financial systems remained secured under comprehensive monitoring protocols. Development teams prepared questions regarding technological direction. Investor relations managed carefully calibrated communication with key investment partners. Legal counsel addressed preliminary response to Alexander's threatened shareholder action. Throughout this multidimensional activity, Valerie focused intently on preparation for the technical briefing that would ultimately determine development team confidence regardless of governance mandate or financial stabilization. Unlike Alexander, who relied on charismatic presentation and vague technological promises, she developed meticulously structured explanation of both theoretical foundations and practical implementation pathways, addressing the substantive questions technical personnel would inevitably raise rather than merely offering inspirational vision without execution framework. At precisely 2 p.m., Valerie entered the main development center auditorium where Reynolds Technologies technical personnel had gathered with mixture of confusion, concern, and curiosity regarding both the governance intervention and potential technological redirection. Unlike the executive conference rooms that had witnessed the previous night's corporate revolution, this environment represented substantive operational reality where actual development occurred beneath the aspirational claims that characterized investor presentations and media appearances. The atmosphere reflected the uncertainty such environments inevitably experience during leadership transition, hushed conversations immediately silencing as she entered, expressions ranging from skeptical assessment to cautious optimism, postures demonstrating both defensive concern and professional curiosity. Unlike Alexander, who typically managed such situations through charismatic performance designed to generate emotional alignment rather than intellectual understanding, Valerie recognized that this audience required substantive expertise rather than inspirational rhetoric. Good afternoon, she began with straightforward professionalism once Howard had provided brief introduction establishing the governance context for her presentation. I recognize this represents unexpected development for most of you, both in terms of corporate structure and technological direction. My objective today is providing substantive understanding of quantum resonance methodology and its potential application within Reynolds Technologies' development framework rather than merely announcing directional change without technical foundation. This opening established perfect tone for technical audience, acknowledging the disruptive situation while immediately focusing on substantive information rather than political positioning or inspirational generalities. The development team's body language shifted subtly toward attentive engagement, professional curiosity overcoming initial skepticism as her approach signaled genuine technical substance rather than merely corporate performance. Before addressing the resonance methodology specifically, Valerie continued with characteristic precision, I want to acknowledge the legitimate progress Reynolds Technologies has achieved with the isolation approach to quantum coherence. The three-node stability you've established represents significant accomplishment despite the challenges preventing further scaling with current architectural limitations. This recognition of actual technical achievement rather than merely highlighting limitations reflected sophisticated leadership approach, validating legitimate progress while establishing accurate baseline for future development rather than either exaggerating capabilities or dismissively undervaluing existing work. Several senior developers noted appreciation for this balanced assessment that contrasted sharply with the disconnected claims that had characterized previous leadership communication. Over the next 90 minutes, Valerie presented comprehensive explanation of quantum resonance methodology that reflected both theoretical sophistication and practical implementation understanding, explaining complex concepts with precise clarity while addressing specific engineering challenges. The approach presented alongside its advantages. Unlike Alexander's presentations that relied on impressive visuals masking technical inadequacy, she provided substantive explanation of both the approach's capabilities and its limitations, establishing credible foundation for development planning rather than merely inspirational promises. The technical team's response evolved from initial skepticism to engaged participation, questions becoming increasingly sophisticated as they recognized her genuine expertise, body language shifting from defensive concern to professional curiosity, side conversations transforming from anxious speculation to constructive technical discussion. The transition represented organic validation entirely separate from governance mandate or leadership authority, peer recognition of substantive capability regardless of formal position or corporate narrative. The most immediate question Lisa Chen raised during the discussion period following Valerie's presentation concerns practical transition pathway from our current architecture to the resonance approach. The methodologies appear fundamentally different despite addressing similar coherence challenges. This practical implementation question reflected the development team's shift from abstract assessment to concrete planning, engaging with the resonance methodology as viable direction rather than merely theoretical alternative. Valerie had anticipated this critical transition in her preparation and responded accordingly. You've identified precisely the most important integration challenge, she acknowledged with collegial respect that established peer relationship rather than hierarchical authority. I've prepared detailed transition framework that preserves approximately 67% of existing development while redirecting resources toward the resonance implementation through phased approach rather than abrupt architectural abandonment. This specific preservation percentage and phased methodology reflected sophisticated understanding of both technical requirements and human psychology, addressing the practical engineering concerns alongside the professional investment developers had made in existing approaches. She displayed detailed transition roadmap that mapped specific components between architectural approaches, identifying preservation opportunities alongside necessary redirection requirements. This framework represents preliminary recommendation rather than fixed mandate, Valerie emphasized, establishing collaborative approach rather than directive implementation. Your expertise regarding Reynolds' existing infrastructure will be essential for optimizing transition pathway and identifying preservation opportunities beyond those I've outlined from external assessment. This invitation to substantive participation rather than merely directive compliance represented another fundamental difference from Alexander's leadership approach, engaging technical expertise through collaborative problem solving rather than charismatic direction requiring uncritical acceptance. The development team's response reflected appreciation for this respect of their professional capabilities alongside recognition of her substantive expertise. As the technical briefing concluded with practical next steps regarding collaborative assessment of integration pathways, Valerie witnessed the transformation she had anticipated as central to successful organizational transition regardless of governance intervention or financial stabilization. The development team had evolved from anxious recipients of corporate disruption to engaged participants in technological redirection, their professional identity shifting from implementers of unachievable vision to collaborative architects of viable methodology. That was. Howard began as they exited the auditorium following the briefing, searching for appropriate characterization of what they had just witnessed. Remarkable. The contrast between their initial skepticism and final engagement represents transformation I wouldn't have thought possible in single session. This assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of the human dimensions underlying successful organizational change, recognizing that technical team alignment represented achievement far more significant than governance intervention or financial stabilization for long-term corporate viability. Valerie nodded acknowledgement of this insightful observation while maintaining modest professionalism rather than self-congratulatory satisfaction. Technical personnel respond to substantive expertise and implementation pathways rather than inspirational vision or governance mandate, she noted with characteristic precision, attributing the successful transition to structural approach rather than personal capability. The resonance methodology offers viable direction that engages their professional identity through collaborative problem solving rather than merely aspirational targets without achievement framework. This thoughtful analysis reflected sophisticated leadership understanding beyond technical expertise, addressing the psychological dimensions of organizational transformation alongside the governance and technological components. Howard's expression conveyed growing appreciation for the multidimensional capabilities that had been systematically obscured by Alexander's carefully constructed trophy wife narrative throughout their 15-year marriage. As they returned to the Executive Conference Center where the special committee continued coordinating the multifaceted corporate stabilization, Valerie received notification of another development she had anticipated in her strategic planning. Alexander had filed emergency injunction request seeking to invalidate the board's governance intervention and special committee formation. The legal filing characterized the situation as hostile takeover orchestrated by disgruntled spouse leveraging marital discord to undermine legitimate corporate leadership through unsubstantiated allegations and manipulated evidence. This predictable countermeasure represented exactly the response pattern Valerie had anticipated during her months of preparation, attempting to reframe substantive governance concerns as personal marital dispute while seeking judicial intervention to override board authority. She shared the notification with Howard and Janet, whose expressions reflected recognition of standard founder resistance without undue concern regarding its effectiveness. Corporate Counsel has prepared comprehensive response addressing both the procedural inadequacy of emergency injunction request and substantive documentation supporting governance intervention, Howard noted with calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the crisis atmosphere such legal challenge might otherwise have generated. The filing relies primarily on characterization rather than substantive refutation, which typically indicates limited factual basis for challenging documented concerns. This assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of both legal dynamics and founders' psychology, recognizing Alexander's approach as predictable resistance strategy rather than legitimate governance challenge. The special committee's composed response to this attempted countermeasure demonstrated their growing confidence in both the intervention's legitimacy and its long-term sustainability despite founder opposition. The technical team briefing outcome provides additional foundation for maintaining the governance direction regardless of legal maneuvering, Janet observed with characteristic focus on substantive organizational welfare beyond formal processes. Development personnel alignment with viable technological pathways strengthens operational continuity arguments alongside the documented concerns that precipitated intervention. This insightful assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of corporate governance beyond legal formalities, recognizing that organizational functionality represented powerful justification for maintaining intervention regardless of technical challenges to board authority. The committee members nodded agreement with this substantive perspective that prioritized corporate welfare over procedural disputes. Late afternoon brought notification of another significant development. Raymond Harris, Reynolds Technologies' largest external investor representing approximately 22% of non-founder equity, had issued formal statement supporting the special committee's governance intervention following comprehensive review of the documentation Valerie had provided during the previous evening's disclosure. Having examined the materials presented by Drive Chen regarding both technological status and financial concerns, Harris Capital believes the board's formation of special committee with emergency oversight authority represents appropriate fiduciary response to substantive governance issues requiring immediate attention. The statement declared with careful precision that balanced accountability with forward-looking focus. We have complete confidence in the special committee's ability to address these concerns while preserving Reynolds Technologies' legitimate value and potential through appropriate technological direction and leadership determination. This external validation from sophisticated financial partner represented significant reinforcement of the governance intervention, establishing investor support that would effectively prevent Alexander's threatened shareholder action from reversing necessary oversight through founder stock position. The special committee members exchanged satisfied glances that acknowledged the strategic strengthening of their position without requiring celebratory comment. By early evening, the first full day of corporate transformation had witnessed remarkable progress across multiple dimensions: development team alignment with viable technological direction, external investor support for governance intervention, effective response to Alexander's legal countermeasures, and continued financial stabilization through comprehensive control systems. The multifaceted advancement reflected sophisticated crisis management beyond mere governance processes, addressing the human, technical, financial, and legal aspects of organizational transformation through integrated approach. I believe we've established sufficient foundation for sustainable transition pathway, Howard noted as the day's final special committee session prepared to adjourn. The development team engagement with resonance methodology provides operational stability while governance and financial assessment proceeds. External investor support prevents immediate shareholder intervention. legal response framework addresses judicial challenges without derailing substantive progress. This comprehensive assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of the multidimensional requirements for successful organizational transformation, recognizing that sustainable change required alignment across operational, governance, financial, and legal domains rather than merely formal authority modification. The committee members nodded agreement with this balanced evaluation of their remarkable single-day progress. Before we conclude, Janet interjected with a careful precision that characterized her leadership approach. I believe we should address more explicitly the leadership structure moving forward. The special committee has temporary governance mandate during assessment, but development team alignment and external investor support create foundation for more definitive direction regarding operational authority. This direct introduction of the leadership question reflected appropriate governance progression from emergency intervention to sustainable organizational structure, acknowledging that successful operational engagement created context for addressing the implicit succession question that had been deliberately deferred during immediate stabilization. Howard nodded acknowledgement of this appropriate transition toward longer-term considerations beyond crisis management. The technical briefing outcome demonstrates unequivocal capability regarding both technological expertise and leadership effectiveness. He noted with measured assessment that maintain appropriate governance objectivity while acknowledging evident reality. Dr. Chen has established substantive foundation for development redirection that provides essential operational stability during this transition period. This careful framing acknowledged the demonstrated leadership effectiveness while maintaining proper governance process regarding formal authority designation. Other committee members nodded agreement with this balanced assessment that recognized performance evidence without prematurely resolving complex succession questions amid ongoing evaluation. I would propose formalizing interim leadership designation that acknowledges operational requirements while maintaining appropriate governance oversight during continued assessment, Janet suggested, introducing specific structure that balanced immediate needs with proper process. Specifically, appointing Drive Chen as acting chief executive with defined authority parameters and regular reporting requirements to the special committee until comprehensive evaluation enables permanent leadership determination. This structured approach represented sophisticated governance mechanism, establishing necessary operational authority while maintaining appropriate board oversight during transition period. The proposal reflected recognition of demonstrated capability while preserving proper assessment process regarding permanent leadership designation amid ongoing investigation of both the concerns raised and potential integration opportunity presented. The committee members exchanged thoughtful glances that acknowledged both the substantive justification for this designation and its significant evolution from the perception framework that had existed merely 24 hours earlier, from decorative corporate spouse systematically excluded from substantive involvement to proposed acting chief executive with operational authority during critical transition. The governance transformation represented extraordinary validation of capabilities that had been systematically obscured through careful narrative management throughout 15 years of marriage. Dr. Chen, Howard addressed her directly after the committee had briefly discussed the proposal. Would you be willing to accept acting chief executive designation under defined authority parameters and regular reporting requirements to the special committee during this transition period? The role would include operational responsibility for both technological direction and organizational stabilization while governance assessment continues regarding permanent leadership determination. The formal question represented extraordinary evolution from the dynamics that had characterized her corporate identity throughout her marriage to Alexander, from marginalized spouse restricted to social functions to requested executive leadership during critical organizational transformation. Valerie recognized this invitation as both validation of capabilities and significant responsibility during volatile transition, responding with appropriate professional consideration rather than eager acceptance. I'm willing to serve in whatever capacity supports Reynolds Technologies' legitimate interests during this challenging period, she replied with measured commitment that balanced appropriate ambition with genuine corporate service. The acting chief executive designation would enable more effective implementation of the stabilization measures we've discussed while maintaining proper governance oversight through regular reporting to the special committee. This carefully calibrated response demonstrated sophisticated leadership understanding, acknowledging the authority requirements for effective implementation while respecting appropriate governance boundaries during transitional period. The committee members nodded approval of this balanced approach to significant advancement opportunity amid organizational crisis. Then I moved to formally appoint Dr. Valerie Chen as Acting Chief Executive of Reynolds Technologies, effective immediately, with defined authority parameters and weekly reporting requirements to the special committee. Janet proposed with the procedural precision that characterized her governance approach. The designation shall continue until permanent leadership determination following comprehensive assessment of both the concerns raised and potential integration opportunity presented. The motion received immediate second from another committee member, followed by unanimous approval that established formal authority transition through proper governance process. This structured approach reflected sophisticated crisis management, addressing immediate operational requirements while preserving appropriate assessment pathway for long-term leadership determination beyond emergency intervention. As the committee's session adjourned following the significant governance action, Valerie maintained the composed professionalism that had characterized her approach throughout both the disclosure process and subsequent transition management. Unlike Alexander, whose leadership style emphasized personal authority and charismatic dominance, she received this formal designation with measured acknowledgement of both the responsibility it represented and the accountability it entailed. Corporate Counsel will prepare official announcement regarding the acting chief executive designation for distribution tomorrow morning, Howard noted as they concluded the day's governance activities. The communication will emphasize operational continuity and technological direction while acknowledging ongoing assessment regarding concerns that prompted the special committee formation. This careful messaging reflected sophisticated crisis management, addressing necessary leadership transition without creating additional market disruption through excessively negative framing of the governance intervention that had precipitated executive change. Valerie nodded approval of this balanced approach to public disclosure regarding significant organizational transformation. The development team should receive direct communication before public announcement, she suggested, demonstrating characteristic attention to human factors alongside formal processes. Their engagement with the resonance methodology represents essential foundation for operational stability during this transition period, and their confidence will be strengthened through transparent communication regarding leadership structures supporting the technological direction they've begun exploring. This thoughtful consideration of organizational psychology alongside governance formalities reflected sophisticated leadership understanding, recognizing that technical personnel alignment represented critical success factor beyond formal authority designation. The committee members nodded appreciation for this human-centered perspective that prioritized substantive organizational health beyond procedural requirements. As Valerie departed Reynolds Technologies headquarters that evening, now as acting chief executive rather than merely founder's spouse, she experienced not triumphant vindication but thoughtful recognition of the responsibility this extraordinary transformation represented. What had begun as necessary intervention regarding specific misconduct had evolved into comprehensive organizational redirection that would require sophisticated leadership across multiple dimensions beyond the governance changes that had initiated the transition. The car waiting to transport her back to temporary accommodation represented another reminder of the personal disruption that accompanied professional advancement. The shared penthouse that had been home for 15 years now inaccessible due to the fundamental relationship transformation that had accompanied corporate governance revolution. This human reality alongside professional opportunity reflected the multidimensional nature of the transition she had initiated through months of meticulous preparation and precise strategic execution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges across operational, financial, legal, and organizational domains as the corporate transformation proceeded from initial intervention to sustainable implementation. The acting chief executive designation established formal authority for directing this complex process, but substantive success would require sophisticated leadership beyond mere positional power, engaging the human, technical, and organizational dimensions that ultimately determine sustainable transformation rather than merely temporary governance modification. For tonight, however, Valerie simply acknowledged the extraordinary evolution that had occurred in barely 24 hours, from systematically marginalized spouse to acting chief executive, from decorative appendage to recognized technical authority, from trophy wife to corporate leader. The transformation represented not merely personal advancement but validation of capabilities that had been methodically developed while being systematically underestimated by everyone, including her husband. The journey from disclosure to leadership had required extraordinary strategic precision, comprehensive technical expertise, and sophisticated organizational understanding beyond mere whistleblowing or governance intervention. The outcome reflected not vindictive triumph but substantive capability, finally receiving appropriate recognition through crisis that had revealed fundamental competence differential between carefully constructed narrative and underlying reality. As executive transportation carried her toward temporary accommodation, Valerie reviewed preparation requirements for tomorrow's critical activities: development team engagement, investor communication, legal response coordination, organizational stabilization. Unlike Alexander, whose leadership approach emphasized delegation and charismatic direction, she would apply the same meticulous attention to operational implementation that had characterized her strategic planning throughout the disclosure and intervention process. The trophy wife narrative that had defined her public identity for 15 years had been permanently disrupted, replaced by recognition of the formidable technical and strategic capabilities she had developed while being systematically underestimated by everyone, including her husband. The transformation from marginalized spouse to acting chief executive represented extraordinary validation of patient capability development alongside precise strategic execution when opportunity for necessary intervention finally emerged through comprehensive preparation meeting appropriate timing. 3 weeks into Valerie's tenure as Interim Chief Technology Officer, the transformation of Reynolds Technologies' operational reality had progressed with the same methodical precision that characterized her approach to all complex challenges. The initial shock of leadership transition had evolved into structured implementation of the technological stabilization strategy she had outlined during her appointment, replacing Alexander's charismatic but ultimately empty promises with substantive assessment and realistic development pathways. Despite the inevitable market turbulence such honesty created, the executive conference room, once dominated by Alexander's theatrical presentations focused on aspirational claims rather than technical realities, had been reconfigured to reflect Valerie's fundamentally different leadership approach. The dramatic lighting had been replaced by uniform illumination that facilitated detailed examination of technical documentation. The elevated platform that had literally and symbolically positioned Alexander above his audience had been removed in favor of collaborative workspace that enabled authentic engagement rather than performative proclamation. Today's meeting represented critical milestone in the transition process. Formal presentation to major investors regarding actual technological capabilities following comprehensive assessment by both Reynolds Technologies development team and independent evaluators engaged by the special committee. Unlike Alexander's carefully orchestrated showcases featuring pre-rendered simulations presented as functional achievements, this session would provide transparent evaluation of both current limitations and viable advancement pathways despite potential valuation implications. Our approach needs to balance disclosure obligations with constructive framing, Howard advised as they reviewed presentation materials before investors arrived. Complete transparency regarding current capabilities without unnecessarily undermining confidence in advancement potential despite necessary expectations reset. Valerie nodded, understanding both the governance requirements and practical business considerations inherent in transitioning from systematic misrepresentation to authentic communication. Unlike Alexander, who had viewed investor presentations primarily as marketing opportunities requiring minimal connection to technical reality, she recognized the complex balancing of fiduciary responsibilities and stakeholder impacts necessary during this critical reset period. The presentation structure addresses that specific challenge, she explained, displaying the carefully designed framework that reflected her systematic approach to complex communication requirements, actual capabilities assessment with appropriate contextual framing, specific limitations acknowledgement without catastrophic repositioning, and viable development pathway based on validated research rather than merely aspirational claims. The graduated approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of stakeholder communication beyond binary transparency concept, fulfilling disclosure obligations while establishing constructive trajectory that acknowledged current limitations without abandoning legitimate advancement potential. Howard's thoughtful review reflected recognition of the careful balance she had achieved despite challenging circumstances. The integration potential with quantum resonance technology provides substantive foundation for forward-looking statements, he acknowledged, referencing the independent verification process that had confirmed viability of her alternative approach despite necessary due diligence regarding related party considerations. The demonstrated 9-node coherence achievement represents credible basis for development pathway despite required reset regarding current capabilities. This validation reflected important milestone in the transition process, shifting from governance intervention focused on misrepresentation correction toward constructive rebuilding based on legitimate capabilities despite the significant gap between Alexander's claims and actual technological status. Valerie's dual positioning as both problem identifier and solution provider had evolved from potential governance complication to strategic advantage through rigorous independent verification and transparent disclosure regarding all potential conflicts. As major investors began arriving for the briefing session, Valerie observed their wary expressions and defensive postures, clear indicators of the trust deficit created by systematic misrepresentation during Alexander's leadership despite their sophisticated understanding of typical startup exaggeration. Unlike her husband, who relied on charismatic engagement to overcome substantive concerns, Valerie had prepared comprehensive documentation and verification evidence to address skepticism through demonstrated capability rather than persuasive personality. Thank you for joining us during this challenging transition period, she began once all participants were seated and appropriate confidentiality protocols established. Today's session represents important milestone in restoring transparency regarding Reynolds Technologies' actual capabilities and realistic development pathway following necessary governance intervention. Her direct acknowledgement of the circumstances established authentic engagement framework rather than attempting artificial separation between leadership change and technological assessment. This transparent approach reflected fundamental difference from Alexander's crisis management playbook, which typically relied on strategic ambiguity and narrative redirection rather than substantive acknowledgement when confronting challenging realities. The comprehensive assessment conducted over the past 3 weeks has established accurate capabilities benchmark significantly different from previously communicated status, Valerie continued, displaying detailed technical documentation rather than inspirational abstractions. Current quantum processing architecture has achieved 3-node coherence with millisecond retention under laboratory conditions, significant accomplishment representing substantial technical value despite considerable variance from previous 17-node public claims. The specific acknowledgement of this fundamental disparity directly addressed the core misrepresentation that had necessitated governance intervention without unnecessary equivocation or defensive positioning. Several investors exchanged glances reflecting appreciation for the forthright assessment despite its obvious implications for previous investment decisions based on dramatically different capability claims. The quantum hardware team under Drive, James Chen's leadership has developed innovative isolation methodology with significant advancement potential despite intrinsic limitations preventing 17-node achievement through current architectural approach, Valerie continued, balancing limitations acknowledgement with legitimate accomplishment recognition. The algorithm optimization group has created impressive efficiency frameworks that partially compensate for hardware constraints through software innovation, legitimate technical achievement despite timeline misalignment with public roadmaps. This nuanced assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of both technical realities and human considerations, acknowledging actual accomplishments while establishing accurate limitations benchmark without unnecessarily demoralizing the development team through exclusive focus on capability gaps relative to public claims. The balanced approach visibly resonated with investors who recognized authentic technical evaluation rather than merely revised marketing narrative. Independent verification conducted by Princeton Quantum Institute has confirmed these capabilities assessments through rigorous testing protocols, Valerie added, displaying certification documentation that established external validation beyond internal evaluation. Their comprehensive review establishes both actual achievement benchmark and intrinsic limitations of current architectural approach despite potential optimization improvements through continued development. The third-party verification transforms self-assessment into objective evaluation, establishing credible foundation for the significant expectations reset despite inevitable concerns regarding previous investment decisions based on dramatically different capability claims. Several investors made detailed notes regarding the verification methodology, clearly evaluating potential litigation implications alongside forward-looking considerations given the substantial disparity between prior representations and verified capabilities. The advancement pathway presents both challenges and opportunities given current capabilities assessment, Valerie continued, transitioning from limitations acknowledgement to forward-looking considerations with characteristic precision. Continued optimization of isolation methodology offers incremental improvement potential to approximately 5-node coherence based on physics constraints identified through both internal assessment and independent verification. This represents valuable progression without addressing fundamental architectural limitations preventing 17-node achievement claimed in previous communications. The realistic assessment of improvement potential within current technological approach established credible development pathway while acknowledging intrinsic limitations without unnecessary capabilities inflation or progress minimization. This balanced framing reflected sophisticated understanding of both technical realities and stakeholder impacts despite challenging transition circumstances. Alternative approach through resonance stabilization methodology offers potential solution to coherence limitation beyond 5 nodes, Valerie explained, displaying technical documentation regarding her independently developed technology without promotional exaggeration. 9-node coherence achievement with retention time sufficient for meaningful computational application has been independently verified by Princeton Quantum Institute through rigorous testing protocols identical to those applied to Reynolds Technologies' current architecture. This presentation of alternative approach established viable advancement pathway beyond current limitations without overstating integration certainty or implementation timeline despite the independent verification of fundamental viability. The careful balancing of demonstrated achievement and implementation considerations reflected sophisticated understanding of both technical possibilities and practical execution requirements. Potential integration pathway would leverage existing Reynolds Technologies infrastructure and expertise while implementing fundamental architectural shift addressing current limitations, Valerie continued, outlining specific approach that recognized legitimate value in current capabilities despite necessary advancement beyond existing methodology. The development team has conducted preliminary assessment of integration requirements with encouraging findings regarding compatibility between existing systems and resonance approach despite architectural differences. This integration framing acknowledged legitimate value in current development despite necessary methodology evolution, establishing constructive pathway that built upon existing investment rather than abandoning previous work despite the required architectural shift. The approach visibly resonated with investors seeking viable forward trajectory rather than merely accurate limitations assessment following governance intervention. Due diligence regarding quantum resonance systems technology transfer is proceeding through independent evaluation to ensure appropriate transaction structure and valuation methodology, Valerie added, directly addressing the related party considerations with characteristic transparency. Special Committee has engaged Morrison and Amb. Fleming as independent assessment firm with specific expertise in quantum computing technology evaluation despite inherent challenges in emerging technology assessment. This proactive acknowledgement of potential conflict established ethical framework beyond formal governance requirements, addressing complex considerations directly rather than creating uncertainty through strategic ambiguity despite obvious personal connection. The transparent approach further reinforced Valerie's positioning as principled problem solver rather than opportunistic advantage seeker despite the unusual circumstances surrounding her emergence into corporate leadership. Financial implications of this technological assessment include both valuation adjustment requirements and revised development timeline considerations, Valerie acknowledged, addressing the inevitable market impact without unnecessary equivocation or defensive positioning. Current cash reserves provide approximately 16 months operational runway following cost structure optimization implemented last week, sufficient for both stabilization phase and integration implementation assuming successful technology transfer negotiation and independent valuation determination. This specific financial assessment established practical foundation beneath technological evaluation, addressing legitimate investor concerns regarding operational viability during extended development timeline despite necessary expectations reset following governance intervention. This comprehensive approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both technical and business dimensions despite challenging transition circumstances. Throughout the presentation, Valerie had maintained focus on substantive assessment rather than personal narrative despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her emergence from trophy wife positioning to corporate leadership. This consistent prioritization of organizational challenges above personal storytelling reflected fundamental difference from Alexander's leadership approach, which typically centered his visionary persona above technical specifics regardless of actual capabilities alignment. As the briefing transitioned to question phase, Howard observed the investor's body language shifting from defensive skepticism toward cautious engagement, not enthusiastic embracement but substantive consideration of the realistic assessment and viable pathway despite the significant expectations reset regarding current capabilities. This evolution represented an important milestone in the transition process, suggesting potential stabilization despite the challenging circumstances surrounding governance intervention. The capabilities disparity creates obvious concerns regarding previous investment decisions, noted Jonathan Keller from Elevation Partners, addressing the fundamental issue underlying the governance intervention without unnecessary aggression or premature litigation positioning. How should investors evaluate this reset relative to representations made during recent funding rounds given the verified 3-node versus a claimed 17-node disparity? The pointed question directly addressed potential securities fraud implications without specifically threatening immediate legal action, sophisticated approach from experienced investors seeking substantive understanding rather than merely establishing litigation foundation. Valerie had anticipated this specific inquiry in her preparation, recognizing its centrality to investor considerations beyond technical assessment. That evaluation involves multiple dimensions requiring careful consideration. She responded with characteristic precision that acknowledged complexity without strategic ambiguity. The special committee has engaged specialized counsel to assess disclosure obligations regarding this specific disparity, including potential remediation approaches that address governance concerns without unnecessarily undermining company viability through punitive measures counterproductive to all stakeholders. This balanced response acknowledged legitimate concerns without defensive positioning or premature commitments regarding specific resolution approach, establishing thoughtful consideration rather than reactive positioning despite challenging circumstances. Howard's subtle nod reflected approval of her careful navigation between transparency obligations and practical business considerations without sacrificing governance integrity. Independent verification of the resonance stabilization approach provides interesting advancement potential, noted Catherine Chen from Sequoia Capital, pivoting toward forward-looking considerations following the necessary historical evaluation. The integration timeline seems optimistic given architectural differences between isolation and resonance methodologies despite demonstrated 9-node achievement through alternative approach. This substantive technical question reflected engagement evolution beyond governance concerns toward practical implementation considerations, productive transition suggesting potential stabilization despite challenging circumstances. Valerie welcomed this shift toward constructive evaluation despite its challenging nature, having prepared detailed response regarding integration complexities rather than merely aspirational assurances. The integration timeline reflects preliminary assessment rather than comprehensive implementation planning. She acknowledged with characteristic precision that prioritized accuracy above promotional positioning. Development team evaluation suggests approximately 7 months for functional prototype integration with existing infrastructure, though full implementation addressing manufacturing optimization and deployment scalability would require additional 11 to 14 months based on current resource allocation projections. This specific timeline assessment demonstrated realistic planning rather than Alexander's typical aspirational claims disconnected from implementation requirements, establishing credible foundation for investor expectations despite challenging transition circumstances. Catherine's thoughtful consideration reflected recognition of substantive response rather than merely revised marketing narrative despite the ambitious nature of the integration requirements. As the question session continued with increasingly specific technical and financial inquiries, Valerie maintained consistent focus on substantive assessment rather than defensive positioning or promotional exaggeration despite challenging circumstances. This authentic engagement represented fundamental departure from Alexander's investor communication approach, which typically prioritize narrative management above technical accuracy regardless of actual capabilities alignment. Following nearly 3 hours of comprehensive discussion addressing both historical misrepresentation and forward-looking considerations, Howard concluded the investor briefing with clear next steps regarding continued communication and governance oversight during the transition period. The participants departed with expressions reflecting cautious consideration rather than enthusiastic endorsement or hostile rejection. Reasonable outcome given the significant expectations reset despite Valerie's compelling presentation regarding viable advancement pathway. That went better than anticipated given the circumstances, Howard acknowledged once investors had departed. His venture capitalists experienced assessment recognizing the measured success despite challenging conditions. Not enthusiastic embracement but substantive engagement with realistic assessment and viable pathway despite necessary expectations reset regarding current capabilities. Valerie nodded agreement with his balanced evaluation, having maintained realistic expectations throughout the preparation process rather than anticipating unreasonable enthusiasm given the significant disparity between previously claimed capabilities and verified achievement. Unlike Alexander, who measured presentation success through emotional response rather than substantive engagement, she recognized the long-term relationship building required following systematic misrepresentation period despite short-term market implications. The realistic assessment provides foundation for rebuilding investor confidence through consistent delivery against transparent commitments, she noted, focusing on forward trajectory rather than merely historical correction despite inevitable transition challenges. Demonstrated achievement against clearly defined milestones will establish credibility more effectively than aspirational claims disconnected from technical reality despite temporary market turbulence created by necessary expectations reset. This long-term perspective reflected sophisticated understanding of relationship restoration beyond crisis management tactics, recognizing fundamental trust rebuilding requirements following systematic misrepresentation despite immediate pressure for positive narrative construction. Howard's thoughtful acknowledgement reflected appreciation for this principled approach despite challenging business implications during transition period. The remainder of the day brought focused work on development team coordination following the morning's investor presentation, technical groups continuing integration assessment regarding resonance methodology implementation requirements while stabilization procedures addressed immediate optimization within current architecture despite its fundamental limitations. This dual-track approach reflected pragmatic balancing of short-term improvement within existing framework alongside transformative advancement through architectural evolution despite resource allocation challenges during transition period. Late afternoon brought unexpected development when security notified Valerie regarding visitors in the main reception area. Alexander had arrived with legal representation demanding access to his former office despite administrative leave status clearly prohibiting facility entry without special committee authorization. This confrontational approach represented significant escalation from previous communication through formal legal channels, suggesting strategic shift following initial shock of governance intervention. His attorneys are citing personal property retrieval requirements while asserting governance overreach regarding access restrictions, reported Marcus Johnson from Corporate Security, clearly uncomfortable with confrontation involving former CEO despite clear protocols established by special committee. They're threatening immediate legal action regarding constitutional rights violations if access continues being denied without judicial intervention. The deliberately intimidating approach reflected calculated exploitation of security personnel's discomfort with confronting former leadership despite clear authority parameters, typical Alexander tactic designed to achieve objectives through personality dynamics rather than procedural compliance. Valerie had anticipated this specific scenario in her contingency planning, having developed appropriate response protocols that maintain security without unnecessary escalation. Please inform Mr. Reynolds and his attorneys that personal property retrieval has been arranged through special committee authorization, she directed with calm authority that reflected legitimate procedure rather than reactionary positioning. Independent inventory representative from Jensen and Amb. Blackwell can accompany them to former office location tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for supervised collection of personal items previously cataloged by corporate counsel following administrative leave implementation. This procedurally correct response established appropriate access parameters without defensive escalation or inappropriate restriction, balancing legitimate personal property rights against necessary security protocols despite challenging interpersonal dynamics. Marcus appeared visibly relieved by clear direction that provided procedural foundation beneath potential confrontation despite former CEO's intimidation tactics. His attorneys are insisting on immediate access rather than scheduled appointment, Marcus added with evident discomfort regarding continued resistance despite clear protocol communication. They're recording interactions while making statements about witness intimidation and evidence tampering despite explanation regarding established procedures. This aggressive approach reflected classic Alexander strategy when encountering procedural resistance to immediate objectives, creating intimidating dynamics through confrontational escalation designed to achieve compliance through discomfort rather than legitimate authority. Valerie recognized these familiar tactics from years of observation during their marriage, having documented similar behavioral patterns in her systematic assessment of his operational methodologies across both personal and professional domains. Please inform them that Reynolds Technologies Security is authorized to implement visitor management protocols established by Special Committee Directive following governance intervention, she instructed with composed certainty that provided clear foundation for security personnel despite uncomfortable confrontation. Any concerns regarding personal property access should be directed to corporate counsel through appropriate channels rather than facility confrontation outside established procedures. The confident direction established appropriate authority framework without unnecessary escalation or defensive positioning, providing security personnel with clear procedural foundation despite challenging confrontation with former leadership. Valerie's calm response reflected the procedural confidence she had deliberately cultivated throughout the transition process, replacing Alexander's personality-driven authority with structured governance despite the disruptive circumstances surrounding leadership change. 20 minutes later, Howard arrived at Valerie's office with update regarding the confrontation resolution. Alexander and his attorneys had departed following security's consistent implementation of established protocols despite continued objections and documented complaints. This procedural success represented an important milestone in the transition process, establishing legitimate authority structures beyond former CEO's personal influence despite calculated intimidation tactics designed to undermine governance intervention. His attorneys contacted Special Committee counsel immediately following departure, Howard reported, displaying message received from Elizabeth Jensen regarding the interaction. They're demanding emergency court hearing regarding access restrictions while alleging evidence tampering concerns despite pre-scheduled property retrieval arrangement through independent inventory representative. This legal escalation reflected predictable continuation of Alexander's confrontational strategy, creating procedural complications designed to consume resources and create institutional pressure despite limited substantive foundation. Valerie had anticipated this specific progression in her contingency planning, having prepared appropriate response framework that maintained governance integrity without unnecessary legal entanglement despite provocative tactics. The independent inventory process establishes appropriate chain of custody while ensuring personal property protection, she noted, focusing on substantive considerations rather than reactive positioning despite provocative approach. Documentation protocols implemented during administrative leave initiation created comprehensive records specifically designed to address potential tampering allegations despite predictable challenges to governance intervention. This process-focused response reflected sophisticated understanding of both legal requirements and practical confrontation management, addressing substantive considerations rather than engaging personality conflict despite provocative approach. Howard's thoughtful consideration reflected appreciation for her measured analysis rather than emotional reaction despite the obvious personal dimensions underlying the corporate confrontation. Elizabeth confirms our procedural position is legally sound, he acknowledged, referencing corporate counsel's assessment regarding confrontation response despite aggressive positioning from Alexander's legal team. The documented inventory process with independent verification establishes appropriate property protection while maintaining necessary security protocols despite administrative leave challenges. This legal validation confirmed the procedural integrity Valerie had deliberately established throughout the transition process, creating documented foundation beneath governance actions despite anticipating aggressive challenges following initial intervention implementation. The systematic approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both legal requirements and practical confrontation management beyond crisis response tactics. Late evening brought another unexpected development when Valerie's secure phone, still unknown to Alexander despite their 15-year marriage, received a message from number she didn't recognize but immediately identified as belonging to Carlos Martinez, Reynolds Technologies Director of Communications, who had been Alexander's closely aligned messaging strategist throughout his leadership tenure. Need to speak confidentially regarding ongoing situation, not what appears from external positioning. Available secure channel if you're willing to engage without prejudgment despite apparent alignment considerations. The cryptic message reflected calculated approach from sophisticated communications professional, establishing potential engagement opening without specific commitment regarding either substantive content or loyalty positioning despite obvious organizational complications. Valerie considered the outreach with characteristic thoughtfulness, evaluating both potential value and security implications despite justifiable skepticism regarding motivations from Alexander's longtime messaging ally. After careful consideration, she responded with precisely calibrated message that created potential information channel without operational vulnerability, available for confidential discussion through appropriate security protocols. Independent verification requirement for substantive consideration despite engagement willingness. Prejudgment avoided through established evaluation framework rather than relationship assumptions. This balanced response established potential engagement without unnecessary restriction or naive acceptance, creating information opportunity while maintaining appropriate verification requirements despite challenging trust dynamics. The measured approach reflected Valerie's consistent prioritization of substantive evaluation above relationship categorization despite legitimate skepticism regarding motivations from Alexander's close associate. Carlos's response arrived within minutes, suggesting both urgency and prepared positioning rather than spontaneous outreach. Appreciate engagement willingness despite complicated dynamics. Alexander planning coordinated external narrative deployment tomorrow through multiple channels, investor communication, employee messaging, and media placement positioning governance intervention as activist hijacking enabling technology theft through spousal manipulation rather than legitimate oversight response to disclosure concerns. This specific warning provided actionable intelligence regarding imminent reputation attack despite uncertain motivations for information sharing from Alexander's longtime messaging strategist. Valerie evaluated both content credibility and source reliability with characteristic precision, applying verification considerations to intelligence assessment despite potential operational value from early warning regarding coordinated external campaign. Communication strategy documentation available if helpful for response preparation. Carlos added in follow-up message that expanded potential verification beyond merely verbal warning. Detailed narrative framework with specific messaging points and supporting materials demonstrating coordinated campaign beyond isolated response despite confidentiality concerns regarding disclosure. This offer of documentary evidence transformed unverifiable warning into potentially actionable intelligence despite legitimate questions regarding Carlos's motivations for apparent disloyalty to Alexander given their long professional alignment throughout Reynolds Technologies' development. Valerie considered both the offer's substantive value and security implications with characteristic thoroughness, evaluating verification approaches that balanced information acquisition against operational vulnerability despite urgent timing considerations. After methodical consideration, she proposed specific verification approach that minimized security exposure while enabling intelligence assessment. Appreciate disclosure willingness despite complicated dynamics. Secure document transmission through encrypted channel would provide helpful verification regarding described communication strategy. Neutral location meeting possible tomorrow morning if preferable despite digital transmission availability. This balanced response created verification pathway without unnecessary operational vulnerability, establishing intelligence acquisition opportunity while maintaining appropriate security protocols despite urgent situational dynamics. The measured approach reflected Valerie's consistent prioritization of verified information above reactive positioning despite legitimate pressure for immediate response given the warning's described timeline. Carlos confirmed document transmission through secure channel within 30 minutes, providing comprehensive communication strategy documentation that validated his warning regarding coordinated external campaign plan for morning deployment. The detailed materials included specific narrative framework positioning governance intervention as calculated co-enabling technology appropriation through spousal manipulation rather than legitimate oversight response to disclosure concerns. Sophisticated messaging strategy leveraging both personal relationship dynamics and intellectual property considerations to undermine transition legitimacy despite substantive foundation beneath governance intervention. Valerie immediately engaged special committee members through secure communication protocol established for crisis response coordination, sharing both the warning and verification documentation while maintaining appropriate source protection despite ongoing loyalty evaluation. Howard, Janet and Michael responded with characteristic efficiency, joining secure conference call within 45 minutes despite late evening timing to evaluate both intelligence credibility and response requirements given imminent external campaign deployment. The documentation appears authentic based on formatting consistency with previous communications strategies, Janet noted following thorough review of transmitted materials despite legitimate questions regarding source motivations. Messaging approach aligns with Alexander's typical crisis management playbook though more sophisticated narrative integration than previous response frameworks despite consistent positioning themes. This verification assessment established sufficient credibility for response preparation despite continuing questions regarding Carlos's specific motivations for apparent disloyalty to Alexander given their long professional alignment. The special committee focused on substantive implications rather than source speculation, evaluating appropriate countermeasures given the coordinated campaign's potential impact despite late notification timing. The narrative framework leverages both personal relationship dynamics and intellectual property considerations to undermine transition legitimacy, Michael observed with characteristic analytical precision, identifying core messaging strategy beneath tactical implementation details. Emotional positioning regarding marital betrayal creates distraction from governance substance while technology theft allegations establish alternative framework for capability disparity explanation despite documented misrepresentation evidence. This sophisticated assessment identified fundamental messaging objectives beyond tactical implementation details, recognizing strategic narrative construction designed to reframe governance intervention despite substantive foundation beneath leadership transition. The special committee evaluated response approaches with similar analytical depth, considering both reactive countering and proactive positioning despite compressed timeline given morning deployment schedule. Immediate response requirement creates natural reactive positioning that reinforces their narrative framework, Valerie noted. Applying communications strategy analysis despite lack of formal background in public relations disciplines. Proactive disclosure regarding anticipated campaign creates alternative framing opportunity while demonstrating strategic foreknowledge despite challenging timeline considerations. This nuanced assessment reflected sophisticated understanding of narrative dynamics beyond typical crisis response tactics, recognizing opportunity for positioning advantage through strategic disclosure rather than merely reactive countering despite challenging circumstances. The special committee members considered this approach with thoughtful evaluation, recognizing potential advantages despite unconventional methodology given traditional crisis management playbooks. Controlled disclosure through selected channels could establish narrative framework before coordinated campaign deployment, Howard agreed. Adapting venture capital crisis management experience to corporate governance context despite unique circumstances. Transparent acknowledgement of anticipated messaging while reinforcing governance substance creates undermining framework for emotional manipulation tactics despite challenging personal elements within campaign positioning. This strategic alignment reflected shared recognition of opportunity beyond typical crisis response approaches, establishing proactive positioning through controlled disclosure rather than merely reactive countering despite compressed timeline considerations. The special committee authorized immediate implementation of this approach, with Howard engaging crisis management firm while Valerie prepared specific messaging framework despite late evening timing. Within 90 minutes, carefully crafted communication had been distributed to key stakeholders through secure channels established during transition implementation, board members, major investors, senior management, and selected media contacts with appropriate technology expertise for substantive evaluation. The message acknowledged anticipated campaign while reinforcing governance substance beneath transition actions despite challenging personal elements within expected narrative positioning. Reynolds Technologies Special Committee has received credible information regarding coordinated external communication campaign scheduled for tomorrow morning. The anticipated messaging reportedly positions recent governance intervention as activist hijacking, enabling technology theft through spousal manipulation rather than legitimate oversight response to disclosure concerns regarding technological capabilities, misrepresentation, and financial irregularities documentation. This preemptive disclosure reflects ongoing commitment to transparency despite challenging transition circumstances. Comprehensive evidence supporting governance intervention remains available through appropriate channels, including independent verification of capabilities assessment, documented financial irregularities, and specific misrepresentation instances through formal investor communications despite narrative complications created by personal relationship dynamics between former CEO and interim leadership. The special committee remains focused on substantive corporate governance despite anticipated emotional positioning through external campaign. Stakeholder questions regarding specific allegations within tomorrow's expected messaging should be directed to appropriate committee representative through established channels rather than reactive engagement with campaign materials despite natural response inclination given challenging characterizations. This measured communication established proactive positioning without unnecessary detail or defensive elaboration, acknowledging anticipated campaign while reinforcing governance substance beneath transition actions despite challenging personal dynamics. The controlled disclosure created narrative framework that would complicate Alexander's planned messaging despite compressed implementation timeline given late evening discovery of coordinated campaign preparations. As midnight approached following this intensive response coordination, Valerie returned to her secure accommodation with characteristic focus on substantive considerations rather than personal implications despite the obviously targeted nature of Alexander's planned campaign. Unlike her husband, who experienced professional challenges as fundamentally personal affronts requiring emotional response, she maintained analytical separation between corporate governance requirements and relationship dynamics despite their obvious intersection within current circumstances. Tomorrow would bring inevitable media turbulence as Alexander's coordinated campaign deployed across multiple channels despite preemptive disclosure through selected stakeholder communications. The narrative battlefield would expand beyond corporate governance considerations to include personal relationship characterizations and intellectual property allegations despite substantive foundation beneath transition actions. This escalation represented predictable evolution following initial shock of governance intervention, reflecting Alexander's strategic adaptation from procedural resistance to reputation warfare despite documented evidence supporting leadership change. For tonight, however, Valerie focused on implementation preparation rather than emotional reaction despite the obviously personal dimensions of Alexander's planned messaging. The contingency planning she had methodically developed throughout transition implementation included specific response frameworks for reputation attacks leveraging personal relationship dynamics, another reflection of her comprehensive preparation beyond merely technical considerations despite challenging circumstances. The trophy wife narrative that Alexander had carefully constructed throughout their 15-year marriage would face its most aggressive deployment yet through tomorrow's coordinated campaign, positioning her emergence from decorative spouse to corporate leadership as calculated manipulation rather than documented capability despite comprehensive evidence supporting her technical expertise and strategic acumen. This narrative warfare represented final evolution of the systematic marginalization she had experienced throughout the relationship, transforming subtle diminishment into explicit character assassination despite substantive foundation beneath her transition role. Yet this predictable escalation had been anticipated in her strategic planning, with specific response frameworks developed for personal attacks despite primary focus on corporate governance considerations. The preemptive disclosure implemented tonight represented first component of comprehensive response approach that would maintain focus on substantive considerations despite inevitable emotional positioning through Alexander's coordinated campaign. The transformation from trophy wife to potential CEO continued its methodical progression despite aggressive resistance through both procedural challenges and reputation warfare. Valerie's patient preparation, meticulous documentation, and precise execution had established foundation that would withstand tomorrow's narrative assault despite its sophisticated integration of personal relationship dynamics and intellectual property allegations within coordinated messaging strategy across multiple distribution channels.